Book 1, Prologue. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The blazing sun was like a greedy tyrant, wantonly unleashing its deadly heat upon the wastelands and wicking away what little moisture it had left. The endless sands stretched out into the horizon, so vast as to engender despair as it swallowed up all other colors with its own drab yellowness. Waves of hot air swept through the arid wastelands, kicking up sandstorms that occasionally blotted out the sun itself. The entire world was in a state of desolate chaos, and it seemed as though the skies and the ground were of the same dull color. The ground was filled with bits and scraps of rubble that clumped together to form small mountains. There were tens of thousands of these things, and they looked like steel dinosaurs that had been buried within the sand with only their backs visible. The passage of countless years had slowly eaten away at them, causing patches of rust to have appeared everywhere. This place was filled with scar-ridden buildings that had been utterly decimated, leaving only their skeletal frames behind, forever a silent testament to their former glory. Thousands of years ago, this place was a city. Thousands of years later, it had been reduced to ruins. 50 years ago, this place had become a scavenger camp. Who still remembered its former extravagance, its glittering opulence, its dazzling prosperity? Who still remembered that this place was once filled with countless high-rises and towering skyscrapers? Who remembered the atomic hovercraft that had shuttled through this place, the aerial motherships that had flown in intricate matrices? Who remembered that this endless desert wasteland was once a vast ocean that was known as the Atlantic Ocean? Who remembered the beautiful, artificial islands that had once glittered like pearls? Who remembered the many underwater cities that were scattered throughout the seabed like the stars in the skies? And who remembered that this place once had a name? An ancient, true name that had been buried long ago by the tides of time, a name that had been completely forgotten. New York. Book 1, The Wastelands, Chapter 1, The Young Scavenger. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The setting sun was the color of blood as it shone down upon the wasteland. The scavenging hour had arrived. Cloudhawk woke up to throbbing spasms of pain in his stomach. This familiar sensation had accompanied him his entire life and filled many of his memories. The scavengers referred to it as hunger, and it supposedly was a perpetual curse which the Creator had pronounced upon all living beings. If he once again failed to find any sustenance, he wouldn't survive the night. As for what he would do tomorrow, this was a question which Cloudhawk had never even considered. Tomorrow, for scavengers, tomorrow was an extravagant word they couldn't afford to worry about. Cloudhawk laboriously crawled out of the burrow he had hidden himself within. When his feet once more stood atop the scorching ground of the ruins, he was suddenly struck by a strong dizzying spell. The ancient ruins around him were filled with crumbling fences and dilapidated walls, as well as scraps of corpses that had fallen down from the other worlds. The once dazzling buildings that had been erected here had been reduced to worthless piles of rubble, buried and forgotten by both the sands of the wasteland and the sands of time. The gaunt youth was such a tiny figure, dwarfed by the howling sandstorms that ruled this place. The wind blew through his tousled black hair, covering up his slender, youthful features. His withered frame was covered with a few scraps of dirty cloth, and his rough, calloused skin was filled with wounds both new and old. His eyes, however, were clear and alert. This was the only thing which separated him from the other, ordinary scavengers. Cloudhawk was only 14 or 15 years old. Scavenger life was very simple. Spend roughly 20 hours each day hidden within a hole or a burrow, avoiding the sweltering heat and the blistering cold. Only during the scant hours of dawn and dusk would you be able to climb out of your hole and search for food within the ruins. Day after day, year after year, this cycle repeated itself. This type of life seemed rather dull, but the scavengers viewed the dullness as an incredible blessing, because any disruption of this boring cycle almost always portended impending death. Cloudhawk couldn't help but think about the old timer. The old timer was an unconventional scavenger who had withstood the vicissitudes of time. Not only did he know how to read the language of the old times, he also knew many things which scavengers weren't supposed to know. He loved to tell stories and delighted in collecting useless things, especially tools, paintings, and books from the old times. The only one who he could share these things with was Cloudhawk, and so the two of them became each other's only companion and friend. This morning, the sun had risen as it always did, but this time, the old timer didn't crawl out of his hole. Still, the old timer was a lucky man. At least he had Cloudhawk around to bury him. Cloudhawk didn't want to think about what would happen to him if he himself fell over. He didn't have much meat left on his bones, but starving scavengers generally weren't picky about their food. The crazy meat merchants would probably chop his body apart into 8 pieces, smoke his flesh to cure it, then hang it up on their rusting steel hooks. They'd save part of the meat for themselves, trading off the rest for some mildly contaminated drinking water. These were the wastelands. For the sake of survival, many would be willing to eat anything, do anything. Sometimes, Cloudhawk envied the others. However, the old timer had told him long ago that if mankind discarded its final scraps of decency and morality, the entire human race would truly be doomed. He was so hungry he could barely walk. Cloudhawk dragged his skinny frame through the ruins, looking like a strand of straw that was being tossed about by the wind. He felt as though he could collapse at any moment. The scavengers had long ago scoured the ruins clean. To find food was no easy task. Would he fail in this task yet again? Would this be his last time seeing the setting sun as well? Cloudhawk sat down lifelessly. The setting sun was making its way down past the horizon, painting the ruins with its blood-red glow. He saw a goshawk soaring through the skies, weaving its way through the clouds, and he couldn't help but reveal a hint of jealousy in his gaze. When he had given himself the name Cloudhawk, it was because he wanted to be like one of the hawks that flew through the clouds, free and unfettered, but in the end, it was all nothing more than a crazy dream. Right. Things weren't over yet. He couldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. Right at this moment, he suddenly picked up the sound of hurried footsteps ringing off in the distance. Cloudhawk leapt to his feet like a startled animal, unsheathing a shard of metal that he had ground sharp long ago as he vigilantly stared off into the distance. This was a chaotic, crazed era. Every single day, there would be starving scavengers who attempted to murder their own kind, and their victims were often skinny children like Cloudhawk. And indeed, the sounds of the footsteps grew nearer and nearer until finally, 3 raggedly dressed scavengers suddenly appeared within his line of vision, charging towards him at high speed. Cloudhawk's face turned pale as he took 2 steps back. He was now so weak that a strong wind could knock him down. 3 scavengers were attacking him at the same time. There was no way he was going to be able to get out of this alive. Wait. Wait. Something was wrong. Although the 3 had savage-looking faces, they didn't have the murderous look of predators nearing their targets. Instead, they looked like terrified prey that were filled with horror and despair. They weren't attacking. They were fleeing for their lives. Just as Cloudhawk began to have a bad feeling about this, a large group of black creatures suddenly appeared directly behind the fleeing scavengers, charging straight towards them. There had to be at least 10 of the things. They were roughly the sizes of wild dogs, and their eyes were a terrifying, rabid red color. Cloudhawk stood there for a stunned instant, his mind overwhelmed by all of this. Only a single thought was able to make its way past the cacophonous din in his mind, an instinct that came from his very soul. Run. The threat of death was something which brought everyone's full potential. Somehow, his utterly emaciated body managed to squeeze out another burst of energy. Cloudhawk didn't waste any time trying to figure out exactly what was behind him, nor did he want to. He already knew the only thing that mattered: those mutabeasts, those savage mutabeasts, were utterly terrifying predators. Within the ruins, and in fact within the entirety of the wastelands, the scavengers were at the very bottom of the food chain. How could they possibly fight back against such terrifying mutabeasts? The first to fall was a woman. She had been the slowest of the 3. "Save me. Save me! Save me! One of the creatures sank its sharp fangs into her neck, then gave it a vicious tug. Blood spewed out like a geyser, blanketing the area with a crimson hue. A second monster. A third. The black shapes competed to get at her, and bloody chunks of meat were ripped off of every part of the woman's body. In the blink of an eye, her stomach was torn open and her intestines and internal organs were all dragged out of her. It was bloody, cruel, and terrifying. For a brief moment, screams of utter terror and agony could be heard, reaching out like specters of death towards the other three. Some of the mutabeasts were too slow to get a share of the meat, and so they continued to pursue the remaining scavengers. They were simply too fast. Just 3 seconds later, yet another scavenger was caught by them. Ah! No! The sounds of bones splintering and flesh being torn apart, these sounds caused Cloudhawk's entire body to turn cold. As the terrified Cloudhawk rounded a corner, a scene that brought him utter despair greeted him. Rubble had completely sealed off the path in front of him. This was a dead end that he could not go past. What should he do? What should he do? The third agonized scream rang out as the final scavenger was brought down. 3 of the mutabeasts leapt straight past the final scavenger's corpse, moving like streaks of black lightning as they sprinted towards the helpless, emaciated youth. Danger! 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 Cloudhawk could sense that death was approaching. If he hesitated for even a moment, he would never be able to recover from it. Turning back meant death. His only choice was to give this last attempt his all. Ignoring what was coming for him, he charged straight towards the rubble and dove into a deep but incredibly narrow opening. There was no way an adult would have been able to make it into this opening. Even Cloudhawk's emaciated form was just barely able to squeeze in, and moments later, he heard a rustling sound as one of the mutabeasts tried to burrow in after him, unwilling to give up the chase. The mutabeast was so close that Cloudhawk could already smell its foul stench. Cloudhawk continued to climb through the opening, only to find that he had already reached the end. There was nowhere else to go at all, and the beast behind him was already growling as it prepared to launch its attack. Everything hung on a thread. This was the critical moment, the moment when life or death would be decided. Although he was filled with despair, Cloudhawk didn't hesitate as he turned, metal shard in hand. The dark form was pouncing straight towards him, its blood-red eyes gleaming brutally in the darkness. Its fangs were as sharp as knives, and it was about to plunge them into the morsel of a prey that stood before it, then tear that morsel to shreds. Cloudhawk let out a low, bestial roar as he stabbed wildly, and his metal shard just so happened to plunge directly into the creature's eyes. The creature let out an agonized howl as it slammed straight into Cloudhawk. Its sharp claws left several bloody gouges across Cloudhawk's body, but Cloudhawk managed to press its head down. The opening within the rubble really was quite narrow, giving the creature no way to extricate itself from Cloudhawk's grip. Die! Die! Cloudhawk had become even more savage than the beast as he used his metal shard to furiously stab more than 10 times at the creature's head. An enormous amount of foul-smelling blood filled the surrounding area, coating his face, his hands, and his clothes. 2 of the other beasts were circling the opening, but they weren't able to squeeze in. Upon hearing the miserable howls of the one which had gone in, they immediately turned and left this place. As for Cloudhawk, he was all but immobilized. He panted furiously, his oxygen-deprived brain turning dizzy for a time. Right now, he truly didn't even have enough energy to move so much as a pinky. After that final frenzied spurt of energy, his body was once more swept up by waves of exhaustion and weakness. He had ignored his body's exhaustion, and it was now demanding that he repay tenfold what he had just squeezed out of it. For the first time, he was able to get a close look at the creature in front of him. This was a creature with sleek, oily black fur, long and sharp claws, and terrifyingly red eyes. It almost looked like an enormous mutant rat. Still, that didn't matter. What mattered was that there had to be over 5 kilograms of meat on the thing. This was food. Cloud Hawk grew excited once more. He used his metal shard to tear open the creature's tough skin, then carved out a few giblets of wonderfully fatty meat which he shoved into his mouth. It was sour, pungent, and crude, but to humans who lived here in the wastelands, it was the most delicious of all delicacies. Cloud Hawk normally survived on ants, beetles, and grass. It had been a long, long time since he had eaten meat. As the food slowly made its way down into his stomach, a warm feeling quickly spread throughout his entire body. The aches and pains in his body seemed to lessen, replaced by a sense of satisfaction that was too wonderful to be described in words. He ate until his wizened stomach was once more burgeoning. Only then did he finally come to a halt, a blissful look on his face. The mutabeasts outside had long since departed. Cloud Hawk dragged the prey he had personally killed with him as he began to return to his burrow. He would be able to feast on the 5 kilograms of meat for many days to come. But just as Cloud Hawk pulled the corpse out of the opening, a voice that was as rough as a wild beast suddenly rang out. "Put the meat down." 4 or 5 adult scavengers were blocking his path. The leader looked quite sturdily built, and his face was filled with savage-looking scars, giving him a baleful, ominous look. These scavengers had noticed the commotion in this region quite some time ago, and so they had hidden themselves in the surrounding area, hoping to be able to scavenge a few bones from the dead. In the end, they ran into a child carrying the prey he had killed. The luxurious, fatty meat made their mouths water. The scar-faced man growled, "Put the meat down." Cloud Hawk looked at them silently, the look on his face akin to that of a lone wolf's, a look filled with danger. The two sides stared at each other across the ruins, like a pair of beasts weighing each other up. In truth, in this era the line between man and beast was a blurry one at best. "Put it down. I nearly traded my life away to get this meat. You want me to put it down?" Cloud Hawk didn't waste any time on words. Like an enraged young beast, he threw himself straight forwards and landed a punch directly on the scarred man's face. There was no question as to who would win this battle. In the end, Cloud Hawk was nothing more than a half-grown child. How was he supposed to defeat multiple fully grown adults? In a best-case scenario, the end result would be him suffering multiple beatings, then watch as the meat he had nearly died for be taken away from him. Night finally descended. Covered in wounds, the youth slunk back to his burrow like a beaten dog. He didn't feel any hatred or resentment towards the scavengers who had stolen his prey. As a child who had grown up in the scavenger camps, he had long ago grown accustomed to the rules of the wastelands. In the wastelands, there were no such things as principles. The only law was the law of the strong. The strong would have food, slaves, and women. The weak would be enslaved, abused, and robbed. This was how the wastelands were. In this world, in this age, in this place, morality didn't matter. To be weak was a type of sin, in and of itself. The light of the moon flowed into his burrow, carrying with it a bone-chilling cold that mere blankets couldn't ward off. He was so cold that he curled up into a ball, but the wounds covering his body made it impossible for him to fall asleep. Instead, Cloud Hawk chose to sit up. He picked up a metal box, blew off the layer of dust covering it, then lifted it up and stared at it as though he was staring at the most valuable of treasures. Slowly, gingerly, he withdrew the brightly colored objects from within the box. He stared raptly at these pictures, his gaze distant and dreamy. These were pictures which the old timer had laboriously collected over the course of many years. They were a testament to the fact that the old times truly had existed, but the passage of countless years had begun to cause the pictures to fade and become unrecognizable. Every time he stared at them, his young heart couldn't help but quicken its beat. Every time he stared at them, the pain, the hunger, and the injuries he had suffered would all recede slightly. Every time he stared at them, no matter how much despair he felt or how dark the world seemed, he would feel as though he could still see a few flickers of light. The ancient, bygone era of the old times. What type of a magical, dream-like world had it been? Back then, people had been clean and handsome. The cities had been prosperous and flourishing. There was no danger, no terrifying mutabeasts, no brutally savage mutant humans, and no scavengers who struggled to stay alive in the desolate wastelands. Had that era truly come to an end? Did it perhaps still survive and persist in some unknown corner of this world? Cloudhawk's pitch-black eyes were blazing with eagerness. He truly wanted to wander the camps and wander the wastelands. It was as though a metal seal had long ago been fastened deep within his soul. This was a desire that had sprung up long ago, when he was very young. Back then, the old timer had asked him. Why? The camps were dangerous, the ruins were dangerous, and the wastelands were even more dangerous. This path was a path of certain death. It is because I was born into this world. Since this world chose for me to come into it, I have the right to get a good look at it. Sooner or later, I will go out searching. I'll find that utopia, that heaven-like place. If I can so much as catch a glimpse of it, if I can so much as have the chance to press my lips against the ground beneath it, even if I die the very next instant, I will regret nothing. The old timer had fallen silent. From that day forth, he had kept the child by his side, sharing his food with him and teaching him how to read. The child had spent many years straddling the line between life and death, but not only had that desire not gone away, it had only grown increasingly intense. The old timer had once said that some people were born to be free, much like the hawks. They might grow up in a chicken coop, but sooner or later they would spread their wings and soar into the skies. Would he truly have that chance? He wasn't even able to escape the ruins, much less wander into the endless, unfathomably more dangerous wastelands. The old timer had often spoken of destiny. Everyone, he claimed, had their own destiny. No one would be able to escape that destiny, no matter how hard they tried. Is this my destiny? I won't believe it. The youth had eaten his fill of the torments of the wastelands, but he was still filled with an untamed spirit, and his eyes still shone with an indescribable, irrepressible flame. He slowly placed the metal box underneath his head, using it as his pillow. Only then did his exhausted body finally fall into a deep slumber. Book 1, Chapter 2 The Tartarus Mercenaries. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The calm silence of dawn was suddenly disrupted by the sound of an engine as a vehicle kicked up storms of sand as it traveled through the wastelands. Someone hit the brakes as soon as the vehicle entered the ruins, causing it to come to a screeching halt. The vehicle's rust-covered metal components creaked and moaned ominously, almost as though the entire thing was at the verge of falling apart. It almost sounded like the labored panting of a crouched beast, and the visible tubing of the vehicle shuddered before a plume of black smoke finally belched out of the tailpipe of the vehicle. The scavengers had never before seen something like this, a metal monstrosity that could move. Looks of amazement and astonishment were plainly visible on their faces. This car was built in an almost ridiculously crude manner. Its rusty frame had been cobbled together from 7 or 8 different types of vehicles, and the damn thing was brimming with spikes, making it look like an ornery metal porcupine. It had 4 ostentatiously large wheels that ground away at the earth like giant gear wheels, and the car bumpers had been replaced with savagely sharp blades. Clearly, they were not meant for protecting the car, they were meant for ramming opponents. The entire thing looked both deadly and savage, and it seemed just as ferocious and unforgiving as the wastelands themselves. 6 large monstrosities were chasing behind the thing at high speed, galloping forwards on their giant feet. They were split up into 2 groups of 3 that had been following the vehicle from both sides. These creatures looked similar to the ostriches of the old times, but their feet were wider and thicker, while their bodies were much firmer and more muscular. Not only could they move across the desert at breakneck speeds, they were able to carry extremely heavy loads of weight. In the wastelands, they were considered one of the most ideal types of mounts. The 6 monstrosities had 6 riders atop them, all dressed in strange outfits. Their haphazardly pieced together outfits were composed of various bits of metal, wood, leather, bone, rocks, and other unknown materials. Most likely, they had collected as many things as they could, then fashioned a crude suit of armor from them. As a result, every person had a different uniform, and one of them who had only one arm had actually grafted a metal gear onto himself as a prosthetic limb. Another person had grafted a jagged sawtooth blade onto himself. In short, all of them were brimming with the aura of the wastelands. One of the Bigfoot bird riders vaulted off his mount, then respectfully opened the car door and greeted the fat man within. The fat man was dressed in a sleeveless leather jacket that was dripping with machine oil, and he was protected by a coarse, exoskeleton-like armor that looked like a giant spider which had crawled over him. His hands were covered with leather gloves and were pressed around a wide belt around his waist, close to a pair of black modified pistols. Even these ancient, improvised firearms emanated the coarse savagery of the wastelands. However, they were a direct testament to his strength and his power. Outlandish outfits, ostentatious appearances, Bigfoot birds as mounts, and a savage-looking vehicle. All of these things loudly proclaimed the status of these men. They were excavators. Fuck me, we finally found some scavs. The fat man lit a coarse cigar. 2 plumes of smoke came out of his nostrils, then he reached up and flipped open the protective lenses of his sunglasses, revealing a pair of beady eyes that were scanning the raggedly dressed and emaciated scavengers. "Alright. Let old Slyfox have a look at how many of you poor bastards are still alive." In this chaotic era, fat men were as rare as unicorns. This man in particular was so fat that he had to be nearly 150 kilograms. He looked almost like an exalted king, and in fact he was as proud as any king ever was. When he looked at the scavengers, he didn't seem to be looking at other fellow human beings at all, rather, he was looking at cheap beasts of burden that were waiting to be slaughtered. The excavators, colloquially known as diggers, were considered one of the more important groups within the wastelands. They mainly spent their time burrowing through ancient rubble and retrieving tools and materials from the old times. They'd conduct some basic repairs on what they found, then connect them together to form usable weapons and outfits. Eventually, they set up their own organization. These people often used food and water as a cheap way to convince the lowly scavengers to work for them. The scavengers would scour the ruins for usable materials on their behalf, and so the scavengers were quite familiar with the excavators. "I'm willing to work. I only need half a strip of carrion each day. I'm stronger than them. Pick me." The shabbily dressed scavengers all clustered around them, fighting for the chance to be seen and chosen by the Lord Excavator. They pushed and jostled against one another, eventually beginning to fight amongst themselves. "Silence. Silence, you dirty fucking scavs. I'm not here to employ your sorry asses. All of you, shut the fuck up right now." The fat man unholstered his pistol, aimed at the skies, then pulled the trigger. This coarse, heavily modified pistol let out a thunderous bang, stunning and deafening the scavengers. They immediately slunk backwards and shut their mouths, their gazes turned dull and despondent with a hint of fear and cowardice mixed within. The fat man, Slyfox, continued to shout at them. "I have credible information that a group of sweepers are active nearby. It is very likely that they might hit this place at any moment. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Looks of utter terror instantly appeared in the numbed eyes of the scavengers. The sweepers. They were synonymous with terror. The sweepers were a group of mutant bandits who were incredibly bloodthirsty and who delighted in cannibalism. To the sweepers, the scavengers were like sheep for the slaughter. Whenever the sweepers swept through a place, they brought utter, calamitous annihilation to the local scavengers. If you end up being captured by the sweepers, you'll be captured and corralled like pigs. They'll rip the meat off your bones, then smoke it and store it away for later. They'll break your bones and make decorations out of them, and the pitiful amount of fat you have will be squeezed out of you and used as fuel for their oil lamps. These cruel words were like a cold wind that blew past the scavengers, causing all of them to shudder. This was just how the sweepers were. They swept through everything in their path, sparing nothing and no one. Sly Fox finally announced the reason he had come here today. Today, I'm going to choose a few dozen strong scavengers to form a squad with us. We'll be responsible for providing you with weapons to help you fight back against the sweepers. The scavengers all retreated by a few steps. Nobody dared to make a sound. The sweepers were legendary for their cruelty and savagery. How would mere scavengers dare to challenge them? Useless pieces of crap. You'd rather wait for death than try and make a fight out of it. When the fat man saw how the scavengers were completely unresponsive, he said in a loud voice, "Who will be the first volunteer? After we beat the sweepers, I'll take him with me when we leave this place. I'll go." A skinny youth with a bloody nose and a bruised face came running over, his face red as he panted from exertion. It was Cloud Hawk. The Wasteland's riders who were mounted on the Bigfoot birds all began to roar with laughter. A teenage child was clamoring to go and fight the sweepers. When Sly Fox saw the child emerge, he glared at him and bellowed, "Can you even lift up our fucking weapons? Just fuck off. I want to go fight the sweepers." A steely look was in Cloudhawk's eyes as he said, "If I can survive the fight, you need to fulfill your promise and take me away from this place." The fat man had a strange look on his face. "Do you really want to leave that much? Staying alive matters more than anything else." Cloudhawk said, "I want to be a digger. I don't want to be hungry anymore, and I don't want to be taken advantage of by anyone any longer." The Wasteland's riders all roared with laughter once more. Such juvenile words could only come from the mouths of ignorant children. Staying alive in a crazy era like this one ain't easy. Living with honor and dignity is even harder. "Dia think you'll never go hungry again or never be taken advantage of again once you become a digger." What a joke. The fat man had been planning on kicking the kid away, but when he saw that look in the kid's pitch-black eyes, for some reason even he couldn't explain, he slapped himself on his own head and said, "Fuck me. Fine. I'll give you one chance. If we wipe out the sweepers and you make it out alive, I'll give you a chance to join us, the Tartarus mercenaries." "You seriously letting him in? He's just a fucking scav. Shut your fucking mouth. You aren't exactly a fucking noble either. I'm the fucking boss here. What I say goes." The fat man fired yet another round into the air. "Even a brat like him has the balls to fight. What are the rest of you are afraid of? If you go fight the sweepers, I'll give you each 2 pieces of bread and a bottle of water. If you don't go, I'll let you have a taste of gunpowder." For scavengers, the most irresistible type of temptation was food. In turn, the most terrifying fear was that of death. This new proposal was far more effective than the previous one. The scavengers began to step forwards, and soon Sly Fox was able to fully assemble his suicide his Lionheart squad. The fat man called out loudly, "Send this batch over right away. The others can wait here. You there, kid? Get in the car with me." Cloudhawk was dragged into the front passenger seat. The engine revved to life with a bestial howl before he even had a chance to find his footing, and the momentum caused him to be pressed firmly against the seat. This ramshackle vehicle was cobbled together from 7 or 8 different vehicles and seemed ready to fall apart at a moment's notice, but once it started to move it moved at incredible speeds, instantly zipping off into the distance. The real problem was that the damn thing didn't have any seatbelts. The scavengers had no choice but to desperately cling on for dear life in order to not be sent flying. The 6 Wastelands riders each brought a scavenger along with them. The Bigfoot birds twisted their necks, then immediately began to gallop across the sands with their giant feet. As for the porcupine-like vehicle, it was now packed to the brim with scavengers. It clambered up and down the sand dunes, dangerously veering right and left as it just barely avoided the obstacles in its path. It was an exciting but incredibly bumpy ride, and it felt as though they were a small boat being tossed about in a storm at sea. Cloudhawk felt both nervous and excited. His entire body was trembling, whether it be due to the terrifying prospect of facing the savage sweepers or the chance of seeing the vast world outside the scavenger camp. Every single cell in his body was screaming in excitement. One thought in particular dominated his mind. Old Timer, are you seeing this? I just made it out of the camp. Shortly after the car charged out of the ruins, a group of wanderers could be seen moving through the sands up ahead. Not only did the fat man not move to avoid them, he actually accelerated straight towards them. Careful! Cloudhawk cried out in shock, there are people there. The monstrous vehicle barreled straight through, sending the first person flying while slicing his chest open. A large amount of blood splattered inside the vehicle like a crimson rain, sprinkling across Slyfox's clothes as well as Cloudhawk's face. A few pieces of mangled human flesh and gore covered the vehicle. Bahahaha. The fat man let out a few crazed laughs, then turned on the automatic windshield wiper, letting the wiper sweep away the chunks of flesh and blood on the glass windshield. He then turned the vehicle, using it to crush yet another one of the nomads. Cloudhawk could hear, sense, and even feel the wheels of the car crush the man's body apart and splinter his very bones. A look of savage, wild glee was on the fat man's face. He took another puff of his cigar, then chased down a third person. This one was knocked flying and smashed to death. Awesome. Absolutely fucking awesome. The mounted Wastelands riders used their Bigfoot birds to chase after the survivors, cutting down the defenseless wanderers like wheat. One of the riders sank his hook into the jaw of one of the Wastelands nomads, then dragged the barbarian behind him like a piece of garbage, leaving behind a smear of blood and gore on the ground. Cloudhawk's entire body was as cold as ice, and he couldn't stop the shivering. A look of confusion and rage was on his young face as he glared at the fat man. Why are you doing this? Scavengers also killed others, but that was only when they were starving. It was an act of madness that they only carried out for the sake of survival. These excavators didn't lack for food. They were doing this for nothing more than pure amusement. Cloudhawk simply couldn't understand why they were acting like this. Ha! None of your fucking business. The fat man spat loudly. And you don't know shit. These are roamers. Killing them is doing a service to the Wastelands. The four main organizations in the Wastelands were the Scavengers, Scavs, the Excavators, Diggers, the Nomads, Roamers, and the Sweepers. Scavengers were at the bottom of the totem pole. Once a group of scavengers learned how to operate excavating machinery to search for weapons in the ruins or learned how to master other tools or trades, they would have a chance to set up their own society and become excavators themselves. Scavengers often drank highly contaminated water and ate mutated food. This sort of inhospitable environment caused many of them to slowly mutate, and the mutation was in both body and mind. The vast majority of these mutants would become as savage and cruel as animals, and they would leave the society of scavengers and become nomad wanderers who would roam the lands and prey upon whoever they found. Once enough nomads gathered together in one place, they would eventually become groups of sweepers who swept through entire regions of the Wastelands. Whenever they passed through a region, the local scavengers and excavators alike would be risk of utter annihilation. How many scavenger, excavator, nomad, and sweeper organizations existed in the Wastelands? Far too many. This ancient city alone was filled with many different scavenger camps, as well as countless excavators and sweepers. In the end, the 20+ scavengers were sent to the temporary excavator base. This was a strangely shaped building that was planted into the ground like an inverted pyramid. This building was quite enormous, and although it had clearly seen far better times, it was still quite obvious that in both pattern and style it was something the likes of which had never before appeared in any period of human history. This was something that had suddenly appeared upon this vast earth. A jerry-rigged truck was parked in the shadow of the inverted pyramid. It had a total of 5 wheels, with the sole frontal wheel being the smallest wheel. The 2 wheels in the middle were larger, while the 2 wheels in the back were almost half the size of a man. The truck itself was large and highly functional, with its sides covered by random steel chains and wire circles. It looked like a giant ugly lizard, but it seemed capable of bearing many things. The fat man leapt out of his vehicle and hollered, "Mad Dog, hurry up and come say hello to the fresh meat." The man nicknamed Mad Dog was the fellow standing next to the truck. He was an awesomely muscled black man who was 1.9 meters tall, and his bald head and face were both covered with all sorts of scars, large and small. One of the scars looked as though it had been left by someone who had chopped his head in half, only for another person to somehow use a large number of needles and thread to stitch the pieces back together. Savage, ferocious, hideous. These 3 words were invented to describe him. Mad Dog was a man of some status, but his equipment looked quite simple and crude. He didn't have any firearms of his own. All he had was a pair of daggers that were tucked into sheaths around his waist. He was dressed in a set of leather armor that bristled with spikes which mostly served to protect his chest and abdomen. His muscular arms and his shoulders were completely bare, and they looked as chiseled as slabs of black marble. The black man coldly swept the scavengers with his gaze. Not saying a word, he turned and pulled open the chains to the truck, revealing the many items it held within it. "Choose for yourselves." The scavengers stared at the large pile of miscellaneous weapons in front of them. There were spears, machetes, hammers, axes, although these were all rather clumsily made cold weapons. For scavengers they were still incredibly rare and valuable. Pick a weapon that suits your hand. Whether or not you'll be able to survive will be up to them. The fat man said to Mad Dog, "Let them enjoy a last supper. They probably aren't gonna have another chance like this again." The fat man clearly didn't give a shit about the feelings of his recruited scavengers, and so he said these words openly and loudly. Looks of terror appeared in the eyes of the scavengers. They had no idea what sort of cruelty and savagery they were in for. They had no choice but to begin to choose their own weapons. Machetes and axes carried a lot of power, but Cloudhawk wasn't strong enough to use them. In the end, he chose a short sword that was less than 3 feet long. When Cloudhawk felt the cold metal of the sword cool his hands, he couldn't help but feel slightly more at ease. No matter what happened, he would accept it. Even if his chances of surviving were slim, he would still try his best to stay alive. Cloudhawk refused to be a lowly scavenger for the rest of his life. He didn't want to die alone and forgotten like the old timer had. Book 1, Chapter 3 Mad Dog. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A faint, cloying smell emanated from the wax paper, assaulting his nostrils with its fragrance. It was an intoxicating feeling that would make a man feel as though he was dreaming. 2 pieces of tough black bread, and a bottle of lightly contaminated water. The scavengers had never even seen such high-quality food before, and every single scavenger was lost in a state of incredible bliss. Cloudhawk's hands were shaking as he slowly unwrapped the waxy paper, looking almost like a devout pilgrim who was opening up a sacred object. Just like that, the 2 pieces of hard bread appeared before his eyes. Their fragrance grew even stronger than before, causing his mouth to almost immediately water. Bread. This was bread. He had seen pictures of this before in books. He never would have imagined that such a legendary delicacy would appear in his very own hands. In the ruins, these 2 pieces of bread would be worth a man's life. No. They would be worth the lives of 10 men. Cloudhawk carefully, gingerly broke off a small piece of bread, then put it into his mouth. He closed his eyes, carefully savoring the taste. He first allowed his saliva to slowly soften the tough bread, allowing its unique flavors to spread across the tip of his tongue. This felt so wonderful that it seemed almost unreal, and he felt completely intoxicated. It was as though this was all a dream. However, this wonderful dream was rudely and abruptly interrupted. A skinny but muscular figure was walking towards him, machete in hand. The man's face was covered with a hideous knife scar. Who was this? It was the man who had led the others in stealing Cloudhawk's meat just yesterday. He had come to take part in this activity as well. Cloudhawk picked up his short sword, glaring at the scar-faced man with undisguised hostility in his eyes. He looked almost like an enraged young leopard. Yesterday, he had already eaten his fill and so there was no need for him to fight to the death. Today, things were different. If anyone dared to try and take his bread away from him, he'd plunge his short sword through that person's heart, even if it meant dying with him. I'm not interested in your food. Then what do you want? The scar-faced man had a strange look in his eyes, which flickered with a chilling look. See that over there? There are only 3 diggers, but that truck is filled with bread and water. All of us are armed. Why don't we give it a shot? There were only 3 excavators guarding the truck, and none of the 3 were armed with firearms. It was highly likely that the excavators had brought them here to send them to their deaths. Rather than sit here and wait to die, why not join forces and kill the 3 instead? Food, weapons, water, these were the most important things the wastelands had to offer, and they would be able to obtain all 3 in one go. When the scavengers thought back to how utterly delicious the bread had been, their eyes couldn't help but turn bloodshot. A communal greed and desire to kill began to quickly rise within their breasts. Kill them all. Chop them into mincemeat. The scavengers all began to rise to their feet. The scar-faced man glared at the irresolute Cloudhawk. You comin' or not? All men had desires, and the desire for food and for life were amongst the most powerful desires there were. In fact, Cloudhawk wanted to join them, but, the experiences he had gone through while living in the ruins for so many years had made it impossible for him to trust the scar-faced man and the others. An underage, undersized youth, even if they did manage to seize all the bread and water, would the scar-faced man and the others really share it with him? The answer was quite obvious. There was no way the scar-faced man would give him so much as a single roll of bread. Instead, all the scavengers would join together to wipe out the weaklings of their group, because with each person they killed, each survivor would gain a correspondingly greater amount of resources. And, would the scavengers even be able to succeed? This seemed like an idiotic question. 20 against 3. The answer was obvious. But, for some reason, Cloudhawk had a very bad feeling about what was going to happen. Cloudhawk snuck a glance at the black man. When he did, he couldn't help but feel his scalp grow numb. It was as though a bucket of ice water had just been poured over his head. The savage-looking black man was actually looking straight at the scavengers, as though he could hear what they were saying. Their gazes met in midair. Cloudhawk felt as though he had been struck by a thunderbolt. The pitifully limited vocabulary he possessed wasn't even close to being enough to describe the feeling those eyes had given him. That sharp, fierce glare contained an indescribable, awesome power within them. It didn't feel like the gaze of a man, rather, it felt like the gaze of a terrifying mutabeast. There was a naked warning in that gaze. All of you are nothing more than a group of pitifully weak prey. You aren't even worth worrying about. Cloudhawk could sense every muscle in his body turning taut with fear. It was as though he was a juvenile animal who had just been paralyzed with terror. Although he knew he had no chance of surviving, his subconscious desire was to fight back. Don't go. Cloudhawk summoned every scrap of courage and strength he had to finally break their shared gaze, only to find that he had drenched himself in icy sweat. He whispered, "You are all gonna die. You useless piece of crap." The scar-faced man spat hard, then said to the other scavengers, "Let's kill those diggers, then come back and deal with this piece of trash." All right. The 20+ excavators began to move in unison, their eyes filled with silent grimness. Everyone who lived within the wastelands knew exactly what that grim look signified. The scavengers had transformed into a pack of wolves, or, to be precise, they had become a pack of hungry wolves stalking their prey. Mad Dog was neither nervous nor impatient. He just continued to puff on his cigarette as though the pack of hungry human wolves in front of him didn't even exist. He did give a glance to the skinny youth who was silently squatting next to the wall, chewing on a piece of bread. That particular scav was a bit interesting. He was quite clever and sharp. The kid's gaze had been almost bestial, filled with a certain stubborn wildness. He had actually managed to trade stares with Mad Dog for quite some time without breaking down. Most importantly of all, the kid had a good nose for danger. Was that the reason why he had elected not to join the others in their suicidal actions? What an interesting kid. What're you doing? You lookin' to die. You overestimate yourselves, you cockroaches. All of you need to back the fuck up. By now, the other two mercenaries also noticed that the scavengers were beginning to move. They pulled out their weapons, menacing looks on their faces as they cursed angrily. The scavengers, however, didn't respond to them at all as they continued to draw closer and closer. Ehehe. Come on, guys. Why you gotta be like this? Mad Dog let out a deep, hoarse chuckle that sounded like the hooting of an owl. When he smiled, the hideous scars across his face began to twist and turn like so many ugly centipedes. He casually tossed his cigarette to the ground, then used the tip of his boot to grind it into the mud. You know, I was feeling pretty bored. Step aside, rookies. Mad Dog, boss, don't. The two mercenaries exchanged a glance with Mad Dog, then immediately shut their mouths. They silently stepped aside, looks of sympathy on their faces as they glanced at the foolish scavengers. Mad Dog began to grin savagely as he slowly pulled out his two gleaming machetes. The machetes were shaped somewhat like kukris, except the backs of the machetes were flat while the blades were curved. The blades were extremely wide and very top-heavy and would require tremendous wrist strength to use properly. The shocking thing was, after Mad Dog pulled them out he then casually tossed them to the ground, balling up his fists as he walked towards the scavengers. Why did he throw his weapons away? Why was he able to face more than 20 men without looking the slightest bit nervous? Why was he walking straight towards a large group of armed scavengers by himself? The scavengers had lost all rationality by now. They had bloodthirsty looks on their faces, and they were brimming with the desire to do murder. None of what Mad Dog was doing made any sense, but all such considerations had long ago fled their minds. The scar-faced man let out a loud roar. Kill! And just like that, the dozens of scavengers charged forwards like a pack of starving mongrels. The scar-faced man lifted his machete up high, charging at the forefront of his pack. On his right was a scavenger who wielded a metal rod, while to his left was a scavenger who held an axe. These were the three strongest and most agile scavengers in this group, which was why they led the vanguard in this charge. Split their heads open. Chop their arms off. Take everything which belonged to them. This was what the scar-faced man was thinking, and that was exactly what he was going to do. Except, as soon as he lifted his machete up, his movements came to a sudden halt. Mad Dog reached out lightning-fast with his right hand, his 5 fingers closing over his opponent's wrist. Crack! The wrist was twisted in the opposite direction, twisted so hard that the bones could be seen poking out of the skin as blood poured out from the puncture wounds. Next, Mad Dog followed up with a sweeping kick from his right leg. This kick landed upon the scar-faced man's legs with the power of a steel whip, and the scar-faced man was suddenly shortened as his legs suddenly bent to a terrifyingly unnatural degree. The bones within his legs had been cleanly snapped apart in multiple places. Finally, there came a punch. The scar-faced man's chest was completely caved in by this punch. 8 of his ribs were shattered into tiny pieces, and he was sent flying backwards like a sandbag, instantly knocking flat several of the scavengers who were behind him. Right at this moment, the metal rod came slamming down towards Mad Dog. Mad Dog made it look as easy as picking flowers, a grab, a pull, a toss. He first grabbed the metal rod, pulled it away from the man with force, and then sent it back to him in a furious blow by slamming the rod straight through the man's mouth. This forceful entry first shattered the man's teeth into tiny bits, and then, crunch. A clear sound rang out as the metal rod exited through the back of the man's skull. An enormous hole had appeared in his head. Ah! Monster! The axe-wielding scavenger was so terrified by this sight that he immediately turned tail and started to flee. But Mad Dog wasn't going to let him off. He leaped into the air, bounding nearly 2 meters high as he lifted his right leg past the man's head, then used it to deliver a crushing downwards blow towards the man's skull. Crunch! The cervical vertebrae was cleanly severed. As for the head itself, it was actually caved into the man's chest by the terrifying force of Mad Dog's strike. The inconceivable power of this strike actually drilled the scavenger's legs into the ground, almost like a nail being hammered into the earth. He stood there, unable to fall down, and of course, he was deader than dead. Ahaha! Mad Dog's savage face was filled with berserk delight and a look of absolute intoxication. It was as though he had already lost complete control of his mind. Come on, keep it up. I haven't had enough fun yet. The two mercenaries groaned mentally when they saw this. The boss had entered one of his berserk states, which was incredibly dangerous. This was the reason why his nickname was Mad Dog. Neither of the two rookie mercenaries dared to move too close to him. The scar-faced man lay there on the ground, somehow still alive and struggling to draw breath. Mad Dog stepped directly onto his face, completely caving it in and causing the white brain matter to explode forth from his face, almost as though it was sick of being in the man's skull and impatient to move somewhere else. Mad Dog had crushed the man's skull as easily as if he was stepping on a chicken egg. This entire process had taken less than 5 seconds. Mad Dog, using utterly brutal and bloody methods, had instantly defeated and slain the 3 strongest scavengers. His attacks were so clean and measured that he had clearly perfected them over countless practice sessions. His power was simply inhuman, and it was utterly bone-chilling. He was no man. He was an absolute devil. The scavengers were all terrified out of their wits, with the more cowardly ones peeing themselves on the spot. Cloudhawk stared wide-eyed at all of this. If he hadn't seen it all happen in person, there's no way he would have believed that any man could be as strong as this. Mad Dog charged forwards towards the other scavengers, grabbing the machete out of the scar-faced man's lifeless hands. Just as he was about to begin massacring the rest. Boom! A rumbling sound could be heard as the porcupine-shaped vehicle came flying through the sand-swept air, having flown off the edge of one of the sand dunes just outside. The fat man, cigar in mouth, was seated within the shaking vehicle. His left hand was controlling the steering wheel while his right hand was pulling his gun out of its holster. Both the vehicle and the fat man himself were in midair as the fat man acted. He drew his gun, then shot at Mad Dog without even aiming at all. A bullet tore through the air, moving dozens of meters in a split second. Clang! The machete in Mad Dog's hands was struck head-on and shattered into 2 pieces. Cloudhawk was stunned once again. The fat man didn't seem to possess any skills at all, but he actually was a terrifyingly skilled marksman. His inconceivable accuracy was just as inhuman as Mad Dog's strength had been. The vehicle sped straight into their temporary base. Mad Dog, what the actual fuck are you doing? The fat man stared at the 3 obliterated corpses on the ground. Messing around and killing 1 or 2 of them is one thing, but are you planning to wipe out all of these fuckers? I lost control for a second. Mad Dog shook his head hard, seemingly back in control of himself again. They are still alive, right? No big deal. The fat man knew of Mad Dog's problem. Whenever the guy killed someone, he often entered a berserk state. Thank goodness he had managed to come back just in the nick of time. Sly Fox, what's the point of you even bringing these pieces of crap with you? Mad Dog was now extremely irritable and impatient. Way I see it, all you are doing is wasting our time. How are you supposed to catch any fish without bait? Alright, stop yapping. The fat man patted Mad Dog on his shoulders. Our employers for this mission are quite extraordinary, and the mission rewards are quite incredible. Mad Dog said nothing further. The fat man turned to glance at the remaining scavengers. Enough. Now that all of us are here, listen up, you dirty scavs. I'll give you half an hour to prepare. I'm not going anywhere. A terrified looking scavenger suddenly cried out. This was different from the jobs which the excavators usually had the scavengers do. These excavators were all freaks. If they followed these excavators, all of them would definitely die. Bang! No one even saw the fat man pull the trigger. The fat man had personally modified his gun, and the bullets were custom manufactured as well. The enormous power of the slug actually caused the protesting scavenger's head to completely blow apart. Moments later, the protester slumped to the ground, white brain matter oozing out from his shattered skull onto the ground. His entire body was twitching involuntarily. The other scavengers all felt a chill go through their spines. As for Cloud Hawk, he continued to sit there next to the wall, watching as he slowly popped the final piece of bread into his mouth. He then finished off his final mouthful of water. The old timer's words echoed in his mind. A man can become either a chess player or a chess piece. Chess players could choose how they wish to play. Chess pieces cannot. Every single person had the chance to become a chess player, but they had to be incredibly careful with each choice they made. Once they became chess pieces, their lives would no longer be under their own control. Anger, terror, resignation, none of it would matter. Once you became a chess piece, if you overestimated yourself and still thought yourself to be a player who had the power to choose his own fate, the result would be that you would end up like the scar-faced man and the others. This was why Cloudhawk had already made up his mind on what he was going to do. He was going to be a good little chess piece, and wait for the right moment to jump off this board and become a player once more. Book 1, Chapter for the Sweepers. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Nightfall. Night signified the cold. It also signified death. An enormous rat was skittering through the ruins, its pitch-black form merging into the darkness of the night as its beady little crimson eyes swept left and right. The area around it was rife with ditches of water. The water was a deep green color and thick with the aura of rot and contamination. The corpses of many unknown animals had long been steeped within that foul water. There was some type of algae-like growth which could be seen in spots throughout this area, emanating their dim, sickly fluorescent light. The light wasn't enough to illuminate anything, all it could do was make the dark night seem even more sinister and foreboding. The giant rat vigilantly scanned its surroundings. Finally, it came to a halt in front of a giant tunnel. This was perhaps a transportation hub of the old times, or possibly an entranceway to an ancient, enormous building. It was also possible that it was a building from one of the invading worlds, but by now, none of this mattered. The giant rat hesitated, unsure of whether or not it would go in. It could smell a strange, dangerous scent. Right at this moment, a large amount of torch light could be seen, followed by the sounds of many people moving together. The giant rat was so startled it instantly dove into that tunnel. A few seconds later, it emanated a chilling screech from deep within the tunnel. The giant rat's screeching sound continuously receded, almost as if it was being dragged deeper and deeper into the tunnel. Finally, the giant rat's miserable screeches were cut short, followed by ripping, gnashing, and chewing sounds. A few minutes later, the light from a torch shone over this place. Mad Dog stared at the enormous ruins before him, a frown on his face. You sure this is it? The fat man pulled a match, using it to light the cigarette in his mouth. The layout here is extremely complicated. Supposedly, those bastards are pretty sly. It'll be dangerous if we try to force our way in, and will also set off the alarms. It'll be hard for us to wipe 'em all out. Mad Dog frowned even more. Then what should we do? Why do you think I brought so many pawns? The fat man stared at Mad Dog as though his question was offensively stupid, then tossed his half-smoked cigarette to the ground. Rookies, send in the bait. Several of the mercenaries walked over to the quivering scavengers. Y'all deaf. Sly Fox told you to move it. The scavengers were both cold and frightened. The yawning black tunnel before them seemed to be the entrance into hell itself. By now, even the most foolish of them could tell that they were just here to serve as bait to lure some people out. That was it. But, did the scavengers have the choice to refuse? Only if they could move faster than a speeding bullet. Otherwise, none of them would be able to escape Sly Fox's pistol. The scavengers had no choice but to be driven into the tunnel, raising their torches high as they slowly shuffled forwards. Be careful in there, rookies. The fat man lit another cigarette, puffing slowly in a relaxed manner as he watched the torches advance through the tunnel. Take things slow. Let the pawns stay up ahead of you. The tunnel was both cold and moist. It was filled with a strong stench of rot and decay, and it held many ancient algae-covered tools that lay abandoned. Many mosquitoes could be heard buzzing throughout the tunnel, and it was filled with the signs of dangerous creatures living within it. Cloud Hawk was terrified out of his senses, but also quite puzzled. For some reason, he could vaguely sense that something was calling towards him from an unfathomably deep part of this dark tunnel. He had never sensed anything like this before. The feeling was both subtle and indescribably peculiar. What secrets were hidden within this place? And what were those powerful excavators planning on doing? Ancient items from the old times weren't the only things that littered the tunnels. The scavengers were also able to see many suspicious traces, such as tattered bits of cloth, animal carcasses, and congealed pools of blood. But the layout here was quite complicated. After walking for 20 or 30 minutes, no one was able to tell which direction was which. KKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKKK nails scratching across a blackboard. The sound was ear-piercingly sharp, and it rang out continuously, sometimes loud and sometimes soft. There was no way to tell where it was coming from. Darkness was something capable of bringing out the most primordial of fears, and the fear of the unknown can multiply all other fears 100-fold. The scavengers halted their advance, their bodies stiff with fear and their foreheads covered with sweat. They didn't know if they were to advance or to retreat. The darkness around them was filled with rustling sounds, causing their nerves to fray even more. In fact, they were almost at the breaking point already. Ah! A scavenger suddenly let out a horrifying, blood-curdling scream. Only then did the others turn and see something which they would never be able to forget. At some point in time, the area around them had become filled with bugs. The vast majority of the bugs looked like beetles, but there were also long, centipede-like creatures that were hanging from the walls, crawling on the ground, and even crawling up their bodies. The entire area was filled with the things. Cloud Hawk frantically began to brush away at his clothes, his leg, his stomach, and his back. He had no idea when so many bugs had begun to crawl all over his body. He hadn't felt them biting at him at all, and some of them had already begun to burrow their way into his flesh. He frantically clutched at his torch, pushing the blazing flames against his own body. It was better to suffer heavy burns than to let these bugs eat their way into his body and kill him. Bugs. There were bugs everywhere. They were clustered so tightly and were so numerous, it was like an entire wave of bugs was before them. Even the boldest of men would be scared senseless upon seeing such a sight. By the time the scavengers at the outside perimeter noticed the bugs, it was already far too late. By the time they tore their clothes open, they found that their bodies had already been transformed into unrecognizable masses of blood and flesh, with many bulging lumps roaming about underneath their skin. No. Ah. Several scavengers let out horrified screams as they collapsed to the ground, and the surrounding bugs all immediately swarmed towards them. They burrowed in through every available orifice, and if they couldn't find any they would make their own using their teeth. Run! The scavengers were already at the point of completely breaking down. When this word rang out, it was like a spark going off in a room full of gunpowder, setting all of their fears alight. The blazing fear burnt away all their rationality and intellect, causing all of them to scream in horror as they began to flee in every direction. A few managed to escape the bug-infested region. Before any of them had the chance to so much as relax, the ones at the front stumbled into some sort of trap. Whoosh! A large bucket of powerful green acid was overturned above them, causing the acid to be poured over their faces and bodies. The powerful, corrosive acid instantly began to eat away at them, causing large clumps of acid-eaten flesh and hair to fall off their bodies as bloody blisters began to appear on their faces and their hands. Ah! A scavenger let out a horrified scream, then turned and ran straight towards Cloudhawk. Right now, he looked just like a demon himself. He was clawing at his acid-eaten head out of blind instinct, with the result being that he himself scraped large chunks of flesh off his face, revealing a bloody skull. The flesh on his fingers had also withered away, leaving only the bones, but oblivious to all of this, he continued to just scream like a madman. Cloudhawk stared at this horrifying, breathtaking sight. He was stunned and unable to give voice to his astonishment, and his fear was being overridden by an even more terrifying thought: these were all carefully prepared traps laid out by sentient, intelligent beings. A sharp spear suddenly stabbed through the darkness. The scavenger's chest was pierced through as easily as paper, and the terrifying strength behind the spear caused both it and the scavenger to be nailed firmly to the wall. A steel hook shot out as well, reaching out towards one of the fleeing scavengers and ripping off half of the flesh from his stomach. The scavenger didn't seem to notice a thing, continuing to scream madly as he fled as fast as he could. His blood and intestines gushed out for quite a few meters before he finally fell down to the ground, all traces of life having fled him. This was a slaughter. This was butchery. Don't be afraid. It's all a trap. If we just... The scavenger didn't even have a chance to finish his words before a long knife came chopping towards him through the darkness. The knife wasn't that sharp, but its wielder was so terrifyingly strong that the knife sliced all the way through the scavenger, from the right shoulder blade through to the lower flank. The man was ripped in half, and the blood from his bisected body instantly sprayed across the faces of those around him. His organs flopped out to the ground, and they were still pulsing. The scavenger didn't die right away, but all of his courage disappeared. All he could do was let out an absolutely inhuman scream, filled with such despair and horror that it was like a mountain hammering away at the spirits of the survivors. Is that them? Have they finally come out? Cloudhawk saw strange creatures in front of him, the likes of which he had never seen before. The creatures were completely nude and unclothed, but their bodies were completely covered with cancerous growths that looked like the knots on a tree or tree roots. From head to foot, they were covered with those gnarly, wart-like growths. They also had large growths atop their heads which looked much like the most malignant of malignant tumors. They had 2 legs that looked almost like a rat's legs, with knees that inverted backwards instead of forwards. This gave the creatures superior running abilities and leaping abilities. As for weapons, they primarily wielded long knives, spears, and stone hammers. There was at least one thing which the excavators had told the truth about: there really were sweepers here. In this day and age, human mutants could be seen everywhere. However, those mutations were generally uncontrollable, which meant that every single mutant looked different from the others. These sweepers, however, didn't just look the same, they also kept a modicum of intelligence. They definitely were an incredibly rare breed of mutants. One of the scavengers, gripped by despair, let out a desperate counter-attack. Slash. Alas, the scavenger's knife couldn't even cut through his opponent's skin, coming to a halt before those gnarly, root-like lumps of flesh. The sweeper, however, struck out with the heavy stone hammer in his hands, delivering a vicious blow to the scavenger's chest. The furious power of the blow pulverized the scavenger's flesh and bones, instantly reducing him to a flattened chunk of meat dressed in tattered human clothes. No way. Fighting head-on meant death. These creatures were far stronger than any humans. Even worse, the sweepers were beginning to increase in number. Their stone warhammers were like terrifying weapons of mass destruction, and each blow from a warhammer reduced one of the scavengers into a bag of pulverized meat. The scavengers had completely broken down. No matter where they ran, they would die. Faced with certain death, they all began to flee wildly, but they also knew that in the end they would end up as flattened hunks of flesh. The endless horror of it all, coupled with unrelenting despair, nibbled away at their minds and their sanity. The little bit of strength and sanity they had left was only enough for them to cry and howl in misery. Something like this, if you never experienced them yourself, you would never be able to truly imagine what those howls sounded like. Anguished howls, intermixed with the sounds of bones being crunched and shattered. It formed a strange, almost musical cadence that echoed throughout the tunnels, a song that was composed from the devil himself, a song that no one who heard it would ever be able to forget. One warm body after another was broken down and destroyed. One life after another was callously snuffed out. Prior to this, Cloudhawk had never truly understood the concept of what hell meant. In this instant, all of his courage and his heroic aspirations vanished as he heard those hideous screams. The only thing he left was a gambler's desire to try the cards one final time as he followed the few surviving scavengers as they charged towards a passageway with fairly few sweepers. Crunch. The sound of yet another body being physically blown apart could be heard. One of the comrades who had been by his side just moments ago was suddenly felled by the hammer of a pursuing sweeper. Multiple sweepers immediately swarmed forwards, surrounding the fallen figure and smashing down with their heavy stone warhammers. The corpse was reduced to a state where it was in even worse shape than the refuse on the ground. The sight of blood spraying everywhere provided an incredible shot of adrenaline to Cloudhawk. He felt as though all of his energy had been focused into his legs, and only a single thought was in his mind: get the hell out of here. Ah! Right at this moment, one of the scavengers who was running in front of him let out a miserable scream as he fell to the ground, the pincers of some strange beast having clamped around his feet. This beast's pincers appeared to contain a tremendous amount of force, as its clamping attack had crushed almost every bone in the scavenger's feet so badly that shattered bits of bone could be seen poking out of his skin. Help me! I'm begging you, save me! Cloudhawk fled past him without even thinking about stopping, but the scavenger actually managed to grab him by the feet. Caught off balance, Cloudhawk fell to the ground as well. The scavenger's face was covered with tears and snot. Help me! Cloudhawk howled back, I can't save you. Let me go, BDNV, then give me a clean death. The scavenger's face was filled with despair. If those devils get their hands on me, I'd rather die now. Cloudhawk hesitated. He had never killed anyone before. But right at this moment, he could see a dark figure beginning to move straight towards them. Give me a clean death. The scavenger lay there on the ground, howling with all his might, I'm begging you. Cloudhawk let out a guttural, bestial roar, then raised his short sword up high before plunging at the man's neck. Blood immediately spurted out, and the stench of the blood assaulted his nostrils. Cloudhawk wiped his face, not bothering to pull out his blood-stained short sword. He kicked his right leg free from the man's grip, then clambered to his feet and continued to furiously run towards the depths of the tunnels. This was his first time killing another human being. He couldn't forget the look of utter despair on the dying scavenger's face. It seemed to have indelibly impressed itself into his heart, into his very soul. Cloudhawk's eyes were bloodshot with shock and horror. He felt as though a volcano was rumbling deep within his soul, making him want to scream with rage and anguish. However, this wasn't the right time. The underground tunnels stretched out like the webs of a spider, and he had no idea how many dangerous creatures were living here. The dark figure behind him tossed down its stone hammer, smeared with red blood and white brain matter, then reached backwards to pull a javelin from its back. It threw the spear directly towards Cloud Hawk. The javelin howled through the air. Sensing the impending danger, Cloud Hawk almost instinctively leaned sideways, letting the sharp tip of the spear scrape right past his face. It was so close that it had actually severed a few strands of his hair. The sweeper was rather surprised. It never would have expected for a young human to possess such an acute sense for danger. Cloud Hawk knew that the specter of death had just brushed past him. He continued to furiously run forwards at full speed. Upon noticing that there was a turn in the tunnel right up ahead, he immediately dashed in without hesitating at all. Here there was a branch in the tunnels, with 3 different openings leading towards 3 different directions. Cloud Hawk chose one at random, then charged into it and hit himself towards the back of the tunnel. There was a limit to how much strength he had, and he was already at the verge of collapsing. If he continued to flee, he would definitely be caught by the sweeper. His only chance was to entrust everything to luck and hope that the sweeper wouldn't choose the tunnel he had entered. The dark figure came to a halt in front of the 3 tunnels. It hesitated there for a few seconds, not making an immediate decision. This sweeper was an experienced hunter. The sweeper could sense that the footsteps had come to a halt, which meant that the human hadn't run far. He had to be still hiding nearby, and so the sweeper didn't run blindly into one of the tunnels. Instead, the sweeper intended to rely on his acute hearing to determine where the human was. Right now, Cloud Hawk was hidden less than 10 meters away from the sweeper. His heart was hammering so hard, he felt as though it was about to burst out from his chest. This time, he was completely finished. The sweeper wasn't going to leave. He was waiting for Cloud Hawk to show himself. If Cloud Hawk made the slightest of sounds, he would probably be immediately discovered and caught. What was he supposed to do? Cloud Hawk clenched his fists, his palms full of sweat. But right at this moment, another powerful premonition of danger filled his mind. Cloud Hawk could feel something coming, and he immediately turned to stare towards his left. His eyes narrowed from what he saw. The walls of the tunnels here were lit by the fluorescent moss, and all of a sudden, without making any sound at all, an incredibly large black silhouette had suddenly appeared on them. This creature had 8 slender legs, and its joints were all covered with needle-like strands of bristles that were as sharp as knives. It had 12 blood-red eyes, each of which gleamed with a brutal, savage light. This was a mutabeast's. An enormous mutabeast spider, one which was at least 2 meters long. The dangerous creature lay atop the ceilings. Clearly, it had already discovered Cloud Hawk and was slowly crawling closer and closer towards him. Right at this moment, the sweeper heard something as well. The sweeper pulled out yet another javelin from behind its back, then began to stride towards Cloud Hawk's direction. Cloud Hawk's forehead was matted with sweat, and he found it impossible to tamp down his fear. Time to try something crazy. He shut his eyes, then howled as he jumped out of his hiding spot. Upon seeing that its prey was trying to flee, the enormous spider flexed its 8 legs, then shot out at the same time as its prey jumped out. The spider was a powerful predator that moved far faster than Cloud Hawk did. It was certain that it would be able to catch its prey mid-leap. Just as Cloud Hawk leapt out from behind his hiding spot, the sweeper's arm flexed as it hurled its incredibly sharp javelin with enough power to penetrate clean through a man's body. Time seemed to slow down. The dangerous mutabeast inched ever closer in mid-air, as did that lethal javelin. Cloud Hawk frantically tried to twist his body in mid-air, and the javelin sliced a deep wound through his chest as it flew past him. He had almost miraculously dodged that strike. SSSSSSS. The enormous black spider struck out with its limbs. Just as it was about to latch onto Cloud Hawk with them, the oncoming javelin hit it almost perfectly on its head, causing it to let out an agonized screech. The sweeper stared, somewhat stunned. It certainly hadn't expected something like this to happen. In that brief instant when the sweeper stood there dumbfounded, Cloud Hawk fell to the ground, then rolled to his feet, clutching his hands over the gaping wound across his chest as he furiously fled into another one of the tunnels. Just as the sweeper was about to chase after him, the injured and enraged mutabeast spider clambered to its feet, then leapt straight towards the sweeper. GH. The sweeper was knocked down but immediately drew a short knife and plunged it into the spider's soft abdomen. As for the giant spider, it used its sharp, venomous fangs to bite at the sweeper's neck and shoulders. The two deadly creatures began to furiously attack each other, and as for Cloud Hawk, he had long since disappeared into the tunnels. Book 1, Chapter 5 The Mysterious Jewel. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Cloud Hawk had just barely been able to escape, but he managed to find a quiet corner to hide behind and rest in. His chest was blazing with pain. When he pressed a hand against it, his hand came away smeared in sticky fluids. Although he couldn't tell how badly he had been injured, the wound was definitely a serious one. Wounds like this were extremely dangerous. Even if he didn't die due to blood loss, the wound would probably become infected, resulting in him dying an agonizing death. Perhaps due to his physical weakness, or perhaps due to his severe loss of blood, Cloud Hawk's mind was growing increasingly hazy. His eyelids began to droop downwards. He really wanted to close his eyes and rest for a while, but he knew that he absolutely could not do such a thing. This was a dangerous place, filled with countless dangerous creatures, and the stench of his blood would definitely attract those bloodthirsty beasts. For him to fall asleep right now meant that he would never wake up again. He was tired. He was in pain. He was beaten up. His willpower was almost used up. Death would be a form of escape, right? Cloud Hawk forced that thought down. He hadn't even been able to leave the ruins, much less the wilderness. He hadn't fulfilled any of the promises he had made himself. How could he accept death in a place like this? The old timer would laugh at him. He had to survive. He had to live. His desire to stay alive enkindled his spirit, like a stubborn flicker of flame that began to rise once more. His spirits roused, Cloud Hawk removed his blood-stained clothes, then tore several strips of cloth and used it to tightly bandage his wounds. He had to find the exit as soon as possible. He had to leave this damnable place. The light from the fluorescent lichen in this place provided him with a vague idea of where to go. However, the underground tunnels were laid out in such a complicated way that Cloud Hawk had long ago lost his sense of direction. He had no idea which way he should go. But right then, that strange, subtle sensation appeared once more. It was as though something was calling out towards his subconscious. Cloud Hawk wasn't certain as to whether this feeling was a real one or an illusory one, but by now he had no other options to take. He decided to entrust his destiny to this sixth sense and follow the complicated underground tunnels in a downwards descent. His physical condition was rapidly deteriorating, and this place was as complicated as any maze. Cloud Hawk walked for several dozen minutes without being able to make it out of the tunnels, but that subconscious sensation was growing stronger and stronger. As he continued to move towards the direction the sensation was coming from, he actually saw an exit that glimmered with some faint light. He had made it. He had escaped. This had to be the escape. He had finally found it. Fuck those diggers. The only thing that matters is that I'm getting out of this alive. Overjoyed, Cloud Hawk quickened his footsteps. Just as he was about to walk out from the exit, he came to a sudden halt as a stunned look appeared on his face. No. No. Shit. This place was a 5-way intersection. The so-called light. That was just torch light coming from the torches that hung in this place. The walls here were filled with neatly arrayed bone spears and various tools, as well as a large amount of wind-dried smoked meat that hung from giant hooks. What really terrified Cloudhawk was the fact that there had to be at least 30 or 40 sweepers here. This was no exit. This was the sweeper base. Instead of finding the exit, Cloudhawk had stumbled upon the heart of the maze. There were also 4 or 5 tied-up scavengers who had been captured alive and brought to this place by the sweepers. Like animals for the slaughter, they were completely unable to move or flee. Their faces were deathly pale with despair and horror, but their mouths were completely gagged, preventing them from saying anything at all. Given the brutal disposition of the sweepers, it was guaranteed that the scavengers would have horrendous fates in store for them. There were actually both adult sweepers as well as young sweepers here. However, all of them looked fairly similar, and their bodies were all so tightly knotted with those strange growths of flesh that they looked like tree-men. These sweepers were able to multiply, despite their strange mutation, and they could even pass down their mutations to the next generation. This truly was quite rare in the wastelands. The sweepers were gathered together, kneeling in front of an upraised dais as they mumbled some arcane, unintelligible words. It was almost as if they were pious believers who were praying to a higher power. At the very top of the dais there was a pitch-black jewel that actually defied the laws of gravity and simply hovered there in the air. It was most likely this supernatural phenomenon which caused the foolish sweepers to feel a sense of veneration and dread towards it, which was why they prostrated themselves before it as if it were a divine relic. Cloudhawk was stunned as well. What on earth was this? He had an inexplicable feeling that the strange, subtle sensations seemed to be coming from this mysterious jewel. It was the jewel which was emanating that strange song which had drawn Cloudhawk to this place, and when he actually saw it he was actually spellbound for a few moments. He was nothing more than a humble, low-born scavenger, after all. When had he ever seen such marvelous items? The sweepers completed their rituals of obeisance. 2 of them pulled out a guillotine-like instrument as the others dragged the hog-tied captives over. They lifted up the guillotine's blade, then pressed the hands of a scavenger beneath it. No. No. The scavenger let out a scream, and the heavy guillotine blade descended with a sickening crunch. The scavenger let out muffled, despairing howls as his 2 hands were completely severed. The other 4 scavengers were so terrified that their bodies turned so limp and they lost complete control of their bowels. The sweepers filled a vessel with the spurting blood, then poured it over one of the young children. The skin of these mutants seemed to have an absorptive property. After the blood was poured over the child, it was quickly absorbed into his body. The dozens of sweepers began to celebrate wildly, using the guillotine to chop the scavenger's arms into multiple sections, almost as if they were chopping vegetables. They then linked the meat up to metal poles, preparing to smoke the meat. Brutal. Berserk. These twisted creatures delighted in torturing other living beings. The crazed cries of the scavengers brought Cloudhawk back to reality. He frantically shook his head, quickly coming back to his senses. By now, he was so frightened that his body was once more covered with cold sweat. Cloudhawk really wanted to slap himself. How could he fall into a daze at a time like this? Was he tired of living? This place was filled with deadly sweepers. If he was captured by them, he would end up like those poor scavengers. They'd first chop his hands and legs into multiple pieces, then torment him endlessly before letting him die. Better to run right away. Cloudhawk carefully rose to his feet and edged backwards. But right at this moment, the scavenger at the very end was released from his bonds. Just as they were about to force him forwards and sever his hands, he seemed to gain a burst of terror-born supernatural strength and speed. He somehow tore loose of the sweepers' grips, then dodged the nearby sweepers and fled from them, straight towards Cloudhawk's tunnel. His struggles were useless. One of the sweepers sunk a flying hook into his leg, causing him to fall to the ground. Just as he was being dragged back, from the corner of his eyes he saw Cloudhawk tiptoeing backwards through the tunnels. Cloudhawk's heart clenched. He had a bad feeling about this. He frantically dove back into his original hiding position, but it was too late. Save me! Save me! Save me! As the scavenger was being dragged back, he clawed at the ground with his fingernails, leaving deep furrows in the earth. He was screaming so hysterically that he didn't even notice how his fingernails were splintering apart. He knew that there was no way he could be rescued, but he wanted to stay alive. Like a drowning man, he would clutch at any straw he could find, no matter how thin. Cloudhawk felt a chill course down his spine. Once again, he felt that sensation of incredible danger. The sweepers had ceased their celebrations. They all had puzzled looks on their faces, and several of them pulled out their spears as vigilant looks appeared in their eyes. Damn! He had been discovered. The scavenger who had been dragged back was killed by a single blow from a spear. As for the 4 or 5 spear-wielding sweepers, they began to slowly make their way towards Cloudhawk. Cloudhawk could sense danger enveloping him, making it hard for him to so much as breathe. He couldn't help but begin to tremble as he pulled his sharp metal shard from his waistband. Right now, this was the only weapon he had. Should he fight back? There was no way such a small piece of metal would pose a threat to these sweepers. Any of them would be able to kill him with ease. Should he flee? There was no way he could run faster than the sweepers. Last time, he had only escaped thanks to stupid luck. There was no way he would be so lucky yet again, and he didn't even have the energy needed to run. Was he supposed to just wait here for death? Death wasn't always terrifying. However, waiting for death to come while being completely unable to fight back was truly unbearable. Cloudhawk had no plans, no ideas for dealing with the situation before him. With each step the sweepers took, death drew closer and closer to him. The sweepers were all quite puzzled as well. They didn't hear any sounds at all. Was there really something hidden here? No matter what, they had to at least search the area. The sweepers drew closer and closer. 5 meters. 4 meters. 3 meters. Cloudhawk's heart was frozen with fear. He didn't even dare to breathe, all he could do was pray frantically. Don't come over here. Please, no matter what, don't come over here. But prayers like this were useless. The sweepers continued their advance. Cloudhawk tightly gripped his metal shard, his entire body taut. If he was going to die no matter what, he was going to make a go of it. The sweepers had extremely tough skins, right? Then he would stab them in the eyes. In 2 more steps, the sweepers would be in a position to see Cloudhawk. Cloudhawk was already prepared to attack, but right at this moment, the sound of clear, ringing gunfire burst forth from another one of the tunnels. The sound of gunfire was exceptionally jarring, given how still this place had been. It was the fat man. That damnably sly fellow. He had used the scavengers as bait to help his group attract the attention of the sweepers. After the scavengers were all dead, they followed the tracks to locate the sweeper camp, then launched a surprise attack. Damn him! Damn him! That treacherous bastard! Because of him, dozens of scavengers had died miserable deaths. Because of him, Cloudhawk himself had very nearly died. However, right now, Cloudhawk had to thank him. 2 shots of gunfire rang out nearby as the fat man led his forces charging into the sweeper camp. How could the sweepers ignore them? They immediately all raised their weapons and began to move towards the attackers. As for the sweepers who were just about to discover Cloudhawk, they also joined their fellows in resisting these new invaders. Every single one of the dozens of sweepers had left, and the sounds of an extraordinarily fierce battle could be heard erupting from the other tunnel. Would that fat white man, the muscular black man, and their 7 or 8 mercenaries be able to defeat so many dangerous sweepers? Cloudhawk panted raggedly as he left his hiding spot, slightly dizzy from the lack of oxygen due to having held his breath for so long. Right now, there was only one thought in his mind: run. Just as Cloudhawk was about to act on this thought, he suddenly hesitated. The jewel. The jewel seemed quite extraordinary. The sweepers had all gone off to fight the mercenaries. Why didn't he take the risk of stealing the jewel from them? When most people fled from the face of death, they would flee without any hesitation and without looking back. Cloudhawk's train of thought was undoubtedly quite unusual. However, he was born into a humble, lamentable life. He didn't want to give up any chance or any item which might change his destiny. He already had the vague feeling that this jewel possessed certain inexplicable properties. He was going to take the chance. Cloudhawk charged into the sweeper camp, stepping over the mangled corpses that littered the ground. There was no fluorescent lichen on the walls here. The walls had been completely covered with all sorts of strange paintings. One of the paintings was of a large group of hideous, bile-looking mutants who were surrounding a similarly hideous creature. Perhaps these tree-like mutants were members of this large group. As for the creature itself, it was extremely large. It was dressed in strange leather armor and looked almost like a general. He was leading and commanding the mutants in a war against their foes. Their foes were ordinary human beings who bore firearms, and the ordinary humans were being commanded by a tall, resplendent being. On one side was a creature that looked as vile and as hideous as a demon. On the other side was a lustrous, dazzling figure that looked like a divinity. On one side were the hideous, disgusting mutants. On the other side were the ordinary human beings. This clearly was a battle between darkness and light, a final battle between evil and good. There were too many paintings, and Cloudhawk was in no mood to look at them all. He frantically charged towards the dais. He was going to grab the jewel, then flee. He didn't care about anything else. At least, that was the plan. Just as Cloudhawk was about to ascend the dais, he once more had a sense of great danger impending. He came to an immediate, sudden halt, and as he did, a javelin shot towards him at high speed. Swoosh! It just barely missed him, flying past his nose. If it hadn't been for the fact that Cloudhawk had come to a sudden halt, he probably would have been pierced by this javelin. Dovco, although he had managed to dodge the specter of death, he still felt a sense of terror. He hadn't expected, nor had he noticed, that not all of the sweepers had left this place. This time, there really was no place for him to hide. Book 1, Chapter 6 Passing Over. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Cloudhawk could hear a low growl emanating from behind him. This caused his heart to sink even further. There was a scavenger below the dais, and his hideous, tumor-warped face was contorted into a mask of rage. The scavenger was gnashing its jagged black teeth as it glared viciously at him. There was actually a sweeper here. This sweeper was fairly small, roughly the same size as Cloudhawk. The vast majority of sweepers had gone off to fight the mercenaries, leaving only the smallest one behind. The junior sweeper picked up yet another javelin and was just about to throw it. Although the sweeper was young, he was able to throw javelins with enough speed and power to pierce a man's body. Cloudhawk furiously leapt down from the dais, throwing himself towards the sweeper and knocking him to the ground. Cloudhawk used the sharp metal shard in his right hand to furiously stab at the sweeper, but the sweeper's body was simply too tough. Cloudhawk's own hand was sliced open by the metal shard, but he wasn't able to pierce the sweeper's body. Although the young sweeper was inexperienced, his body was still far tougher than Cloudhawk's. A single kick from his two legs sent Cloudhawk into the air, and he landed on the ground over a meter away. Blood was leaking from Cloudhawk's nose and mouth, and the world before his eyes had just turned blurry. He randomly tossed out the metal shard as hard as he could. Crack! The sharp metal shard actually struck the young sweeper, but it wasn't able to cause much damage at all. The young sweeper rose to his feet, then used his javelin to stab at the human on the ground. Cloudhawk's animalistic instincts warned him of the impending danger. He almost immediately rolled away to dodge the attack, and the javelin split apart as it stabbed into the ground. Although this sweeper was very young, he was every bit as strong as a normal adult human. The sweeper let out a low growl, not having expected this scavenger to be so agile. He tossed away the shattered bits of javelin wood in his hands, then turned and grabbed a long knife from one of the cabinets behind him. Cloudhawk picked up the broken half of the javelin. Just as the sweeper was turning towards him, he used virtually all of his energy to jump to his feet, then delivered a two-handed blow with the javelin as he drove it towards the sweeper's head. This strike used up almost all of Cloudhawk's energy. Crunch! The tip of the broken javelin was driven straight through the sweeper's left eye, going in by quite a few inches. A large amount of black blood and other viscous liquids spurted out from the injury. The sweeper let out an agonized, maddened cry as he wildly lashed out with the long knife in his hands. As Cloudhawk dodged backwards, his shoulder was cut by one of the chops, resulting in a section of his flesh being sheared off. Agonizing pain. Cloudhawk retreated back to the dais. The young sweeper wildly flailed about for a few moments, then finally fell to the ground, a look of agony and confusion in his remaining eye. Cloudhawk panted heavily, completely exhausted and feeble. He stared silently at the corpse of the young sweeper for quite a few moments. If the young sweeper hadn't suffered a mutation, he probably would have been a human of the same age as Cloudhawk himself. He was a sentient being who would have had parents, brothers, family. A pained smile appeared on Cloudhawk's face as he turned, dragging his weary body up the steps of the dais. He stretched out his blood-soaked right hand, then clenched it around the levitating jewel. Boom! The entire world seemed to shake. A swirl of dust appeared above the dais, and both Cloudhawk and the strange jewel simultaneously vanished. It was as though they had evaporated into thin air, disappearing from the world. In the instant that Cloudhawk's hand closed around the jewel, a stream of blindingly bright light leaked out from between his fingers. It was as though he wasn't holding a stone in his hands, rather, he was holding a miniature sun. In the same instant, a strange type of energy surged through his hands and into the rest of his body, seeming to infiltrate every single one of his cells. The incredibly powerful surge of energy covered the entire area, causing space itself to twist and distort. Cloudhawk had never seen such a horrifying sight before. Everything before him was twisting and distorting. It was as though the world around him was a bucket of water, and someone was using a stick to kick up a whirlpool. The invisible energy furiously tore at every cell in his body, ripping every single one into a million little pieces. The entire world had disappeared. Cloudhawk had been brought into a new, strange world with no light, no dark, no matter, and no energy. It was a world filled with many rippling strings, some straight and some circular. Each time one of the strings was thrummed, a strange sound could be heard. It was like hundreds of millions of guitar strings being played at the same time, forming an entire world unto themselves, with Cloudhawk being part of it. Cloudhawk was able to maintain his clarity of thought, and stared in absolute terror at the bizarre world around him. He wasn't certain if he was alive or not. The countless strings began to join together, forming all sorts of strange, chaotic lines of light which then blended and twisted together to form images. Cloudhawk had been weightless this entire time, but he suddenly sensed a powerful force drag him downwards. Bang! Cloudhawk landed against an extremely tough and coarse stone floor. Cloudhawk pressed his hands against the stone floor, wanting to throw up. Unfortunately, there was nothing in his stomach. His head was in a complete daze right now, and his ears were ringing. He couldn't even see clearly. All of his senses were in a state of complete chaos, and he wasn't even able to tell if the world before him was a real one or a fake one. He had never experienced anything like this before. Slowly, his senses began to stabilize. As it did, the first feeling he had was, hot. Odd. Isn't it night time? Why is the area around me filled with blinding sunlight? It was so hot. Where was he? Cloudhawk's nose was filled with a sulphurous smell. As his vision grew clearer and clearer, the look of astonishment on his face grew greater and greater as well. What appeared before him was something which completely surpassed his wildest imaginings. This was a world where the black stone ground was filled with so many crevices, it looked as though countless termites had bored through it. This entire world was like a piece of glass that someone had viciously stomped down on but had been unable to completely destroy. The chasms in the world were unfathomably deep, but flickers of flames could be vaguely seen, as though the fires of hell might erupt from within the chasms at any moment. Far away in front of him was a series of egg-shaped mountain ranges, shrouded in a layer of gauze-like dust storms. The mountains seemed to have been sculpted by human hands in the past, and there had to be tens of thousands of those sculptures carved into the mountains. They were like chess pieces scattered across a board in a neat, orderly, and awe-inspiring manner. Where the hell was he? Was he dreaming? The air here was so hot that Cloud Hawk could barely breathe. He immediately raised his head to stare towards the distant skies, and what he saw caused his eyes to nearly pop out of their sockets. There were two dazzling, light-emitting entities in the skies, a large sun and a small sun. They hung in the skies at the same time, emanating blinding halos of light that baked this cracked, parched earth. Aside from the two suns, there was also an utterly enormous red gas giant that filled nearly half of the skies. Two enormous windstorms could be seen on the gas giant in the form of two giant yellow spots, and a slanted ring of yellow light could be seen circling around this gas giant. This truly was an absolutely stunning sight. How could his weak little heart possibly withstand such an incredible, unbelievable transformation in the world? Cloudhawk felt as though the blood in his body was flowing backwards, and he couldn't help but let out an uncontrollable, shrill scream. The jewel in his hands once more lit up, and that strange surge of energy once more twisted the world around him. There was no way Cloudhawk could endure this transfer process a second time, and he immediately fell completely unconscious. The spatial ripples around him vanished, as did he himself. The world around him remained as deathly silent and forlorn as ever, as though no living creatures had ever appeared on its surface before. Sly Fox and Mad Dog had completed their bloody battle. They had suffered a few wounds, but the mutants had been completely destroyed and almost every last one of them had been wiped out. Man, late-stage strength metas like you really are almost unstoppable in close combat. The fat man roared with laughter, then lit a cigarette for Mad Dog. These were a rare breed of mutants, intelligent yet highly mutated, and with the ability to stably propagate future generations. Every single one of these corpses will earn us a ton of money. This deal will keep us fed for half a year. Mad Dog took a deep puff of his cigarette. He was also quite happy with his performance in this battle. You always end up spending all of your money on women, you randy bastard. How long do you really think this money will last you? I'm warning you up front, you are not allowed to touch my share of the money. The hell? Man, you really don't know how to talk to others. The reason why they had been so successful was all thanks to the fat man first releasing so much bait into the tunnels. It had allowed the two of them to home in on the mutant camp. If it hadn't been for that, given how complicated the layout of the tunnels was, they probably wouldn't have been able to locate it that quickly. These mutants were smart ones, after all. Hey, boss. A mercenary up ahead suddenly called out to them. One of the scavs is still alive. A living scav. No way. An emaciated youth was lying there on the ground, his face as pale as a sheet of paper and devoid of all blood. The kid had completely passed out. Oh ho. The kid actually made it. You gonna take him back with us, boss? Fuck that. You gonna be the one responsible for feeding him if I do. Clearly, none of the scavengers knew what Sly Fox was like and how he acted. He didn't even view scavengers as being members of the same race as him. Why would he ever fulfill his promises to them? He was, however, quite puzzled. The kid ran around here for hours but managed to avoid suffering any injuries at all. He really does have some bullshit luck. Look at his chest. An intrigued, clever look flashed through Mad Dog's eyes. Judging from the blood patterns, there should have been a wound there. A deep one, at that. The fat man hesitated for a moment. You tellin' me, give 'em a try and we'll know for sure. Mad Dog pulled out a knife from his waistband. The knife flashed so incredibly quickly that it could barely be seen, and in the next instant it was already back in its sheath. A bloody wound had appeared on the boy's left arm, and fresh blood began to leak out of it. Roughly 10 or so seconds later, the bloody wound slowly began to close as the flesh and skin started to stitch itself together at a visible pace. Fuck my eyes. He's a meta. The fat man's face tightened while Mad Dog frowned. From the looks of things, the kid was actually a metahuman, but he only had first stage regenerative abilities. It didn't make sense for him to have been able to heal such a deep wound on his chest. What the hell was going on? Take him back with us, rookies. Although there was no time for a detailed examination and no way to figure out what his specific power was, his healing speed alone proved that he had first-stage regenerative abilities. Anyone with a superpower was considered a metahuman, and any metahuman was worth training. And so, the unconscious boy's fate was completely changed. Cloudhawk was dreaming. The contents of his dream were quite similar to that of the paintings he had seen. A group of hideous, evil, yet incredibly strong creatures were leading tens of thousands of mutants in a war against the human race. They were brutal, savage, and unspeakably cruel, and the human race suffered repeated losses against them, to the point where humanity was nearly wiped out. And yet, right at this moment, those radiant, sacred beings suddenly appeared. They gifted mankind with all sorts of miraculous weapons, and in the end they joined forces with humanity to fight back against the tide, turning defeat into victory. The dream was a scattered one which came and went in fits and starts. The exact details were unclear, but the dream itself felt strangely real, almost as though he had personally taken part in it before. Book 1, Chapter 7 Metahuman. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It seemed to happen in an instant, but it also felt as though 1,000 years had gone by. Cloudhawk slowly opened his eyes. He realized that he was lying out in the open, and he frantically sat up while scanning right and left. The area was littered with piles of debris and ruined buildings. They were in the ruins, and it was already day. Had it all been a dream? The injury on his chest was gone. The injury on his shoulder was gone. The place where the sweeper had kicked him and caused internal bleeding was completely pain-free. Even the wounds he had taken from the beating the scar-faced man had given him had completely disappeared. It couldn't have all been a dream, right? Cloudhawk could sense that his hands were clenched around something. When he lowered his gaze to take a look, his eyes narrowed. Wasn't this the jewel which he had taken from the sweeper camp? The jewel wasn't shining at all, in fact, it no longer emanated the slightest bit of light. However, its formerly smooth surface was now covered with many slender veins of blood. It was as though his blood had been drained into it, with some left being on its surface. The jewel looked completely ordinary and unremarkable. Anyone who saw it would think it to be nothing more than an ordinary black rock. Aside from the many dark red lines matting its surface, there really was nothing particularly special about it at all. Woke up. The fat man walked over towards Cloudhawk. Cloudhawk hurriedly hid away the black stone, then looked somewhat nervously at the fat man. This man always had a merry look on his face, but he was actually an incredibly sinister person. The fat man, however, didn't seem to mind the look on his face. He actually tossed Cloudhawk a piece of bread. Eat something first. Cloudhawk hesitated for a few moments, but he was so hungry that he accepted the bread and began to gnaw at it. The piece of bread was as tough as wood, but to Cloudhawk it was an absolute delicacy. The mercenaries were busy dragging the various mutant corpses into rainproof bags. As for the fat man, he just lit a cigarette as he sat down. You know, at first I was just lying to you. But I just changed my mind. I'll take you to our outpost. Why did the fat man suddenly change his mind and become so nice? Cloudhawk had personally witnessed him send dozens of scavengers to their deaths, treating them as if they were just garbage. You might not know this, but you are now a metahuman. The fat man didn't wait for Cloudhawk to answer the obvious question. And don't ask me what metas are. Fucked if I know. All I know is that we are a new breed of humans whose bodies have been improved in certain ways and are much more powerful than ordinary people. I'm a meta, Mad Dog's a meta, and every other member of our mercenary company is a meta. Now, it seems you are a meta as well. A surge of excitement began to enter Cloudhawk's heart. Did this mean he would become as powerful as this chubby white man and the muscular black man in the future? The fat man took a puff on his cigarettes, then continued, "But, don't have too many expectations. There are many different types of metas. There are strength metas, agility metas, control metas, perception metas, intelligence metas, and as for you, you are nothing more than a healing meta." Cloudhawk didn't understand. A healing meta. Mad Dog's a strength meta, which is why he can snap bones as easily as snapping twigs. Strength metas are suited for becoming close-combat warriors. I'm a control meta. I have absolutely perfect control over every single part of my body, allowing me to aim and move with absolute precision. That's why I can shoot your balls off from 100 paces without even looking. I can control any tool or weapon with perfect precision. Then what about me? Cloudhawk was rather impatient. You. The fat man snickered. All you do is heal a bit faster, but what the fuck good is that? If a bullet hits you in the head, you are as dead as anyone else. That's why healing metas are the most useless of all metas. I mean, I can't exactly use you to go block a mutabeast's attack for me, right? The most useless type of metahuman. Cloudhawk couldn't help but feel a bit disappointment. Heh. The fat man gave him a hard pat. Cheer up. Less than 1 person in 100 is a meta. You are already pretty lucky. Healing metas might not be useful, but at least you'll recover your energy much faster than ordinary people. That means you'll be useful as a laborer. Don't worry. Just follow me. A thunderous booming sound suddenly rang out from the direction of the wastelands. This sound started off small but quickly grew much louder, almost as though it was traveling at such incredible speeds through the wastelands that it was generating sonic booms. Fuck. Finally. The fat man flicked away his cigarette and rose to his feet, his hands resting against the pistols around his waist. He barked towards the others, "Everyone, look lively." The resting mercenaries all jumped to their feet, and Mad Dog drew out his 2 snowy blades as well. Cloudhawk didn't understand why the mercenaries were acting this way, but the thunderous booms coming from the wastelands were incredibly close by now. When he turned to squint towards their direction, his eyes suddenly widened. He saw something so completely inconceivable that his eyes nearly popped out of their sockets. A small black dot had appeared in the night skies. It seemed to have come from the distant heavens, and as it slowly cruised through the heavens it grew larger and larger. It was actually a large airship that was at least 100 meters long. There were a couple of obvious patches in the airship's enormous gas sack, and spots of rust could be seen throughout its metallic frame. Evidence of makeshift repairs could be seen everywhere, and some parts of it were actually bulging outwards, as though they were about to break apart at any moment. Overall, however, this was an incredibly complete airship. Its exterior walls and copper tubing were all neatly arrayed, and the engines at the back were constantly emitting plenty of hot steam as 4 sets of propellers furiously rotated about, ensuring that the ship was able to advance at an even keel. On each side of the airship there were black cannons protruding from various openings, bringing a sense of awe and menace. In the eyes of Cloudhawk, this enormous thing was something out of the very legends. The airship slowly began to descend, finally coming to a halt in front of the mercenaries' campfire. As it did, a powerful wind blew past, sending rocks tumbling across the ground in half, extinguishing the campfire. The wind was so strong that Cloud Hawk could barely open his eyes. Clank. The rusty door to the airship swung open, and a black figure emerged from the wind and the sand. This man was tall and very muscular. He was dressed in a set of black leather clothes that completely covered his entire body, exposing nothing to the elements. He wore a black breathing mask that was shaped like a stork's beak, and the mask was connected to quite a few wires and tubes. The faint sound of heavy breathing could be heard coming from that mask, and white steam could be seen coming from the exhaust tubes. In truth, he looked like a monstrous humanoid with the face of a long-billed bird. A look of extreme wariness was on Mad Dog's face. The fat man looked the way he usually did, but his hands never strayed away from his two pistols as he sauntered towards the black-garbed man. "We've already found the targets you wanted. Where's the stuff we want?" The black-garbed man didn't even glance at the fat man. He just gestured with a hand, causing several men to emerge from the armored airship. These men were dressed in white hazmat suits, and they came rushing out with toolboxes at the ready as they moved towards the corpses on the ground. They pulled open the rainproof body bags, then glanced through the bodies. One of the white-garbed men nodded. "They look fine." The black-garbed man tossed a box to the fat man's feet. One of the rookie mercenaries went to pick up the box, then opened it up. There were multiple firearms neatly arrayed inside the box, as well as a large amount of gunpowder and several needles of various colors. The fat man let out a sigh of relief. "Happy doin' business." "Wait a moment." For the first time, the black-garbed man spoke. His gravelly voice sounded like that of a tightly controlled wild beast's, and when it came out from that breathing mask it sounded incredibly strange. "Did any of you find anything unusual? For example, a strange rock?" Cloudhawk's heart nearly came to a stop. The fat man frowned. "This place is filled with rocks. Didn't see any special ones." "Are you certain?" The black-garbed man slowly raised his head. Even though his face was completely covered by that strange mask, all of the mercenaries could still sense an incredibly dangerous and sharp gaze sweep through them, causing all of them to take a few nervous steps back. Everyone instantly felt as though they had been pierced through by that gaze. As for the fat man, he was rather irritated. "The hell is this all about?" "Nothing." The black-garbed man withdrew his gaze, then said slowly, "That stone is completely useless to you. If you are able to find it in the future, I'll pay you 100 times the commission you earned today." The mercenaries all sucked in deep breaths. "What? 100 times the commission?" The commission for this mission was already equivalent to an entire year's worth of commissions. To multiply that figure 100-fold, fuck, what the hell type of rock was this? By now, the corpses of the sweepers had been loaded into the airship. The four propellers once more began to rotate, kicking up another storm of wind and sand as the enormous airship began to slowly rise into the air. The copper tubes once more began to generate those booming sounds that sounded like the rattling coughs of someone suffering from lung disease before they finally began to spurt out large streams of air. The airship slowly began to speed up, then finally disappeared off into the horizon. The fat man lifted up the chest, a completely satisfied look on his face. He walked next to the wide-eyed and slack-jawed Cloud Hawk, then gave him a hard slap on the shoulders. "Crazy, right? That thing is a hell of a high-class toy." Cloud Hawk tightly clenched the rock in his hand, trying to do his best to act normally. His voice, however, couldn't help but quaver a bit. Who were they? A bunch of mysterious bastards. Who knows? Some of the real rulers of the wastelands, that's for sure. The fat man clearly didn't know much about them either. Doesn't really matter. Small fry like you will probably never have a chance to meet people like them. Hell, best if you don't. Those guys really do kill people without even batting an eyelid. To them, we're nothing more than ants. Were they truly so strong that even these powerful mercenaries looked up to them in awe? Cloudhawk had no idea what sort of amazing treasure he had stumbled upon. The mysterious rock just lay there calmly within his hand, and when it pressed against his flesh he felt as though the rock was part of his body. The fat man called out in a loud voice, "Form up, form up. We're going back." The mercenaries all whooped in celebration as they boarded their patchwork vehicle. The crude, multi-wheel behemoth let out a few angry rumbles, then began to charge through the uneven wastelands. Book 1, Chapter 8 Black Flag Outpost. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The setting sun was as red as blood, staining the ground with its crimson light. Sand was being kicked up throughout the desert wastelands. The patchwork vehicle was like a berserk animal that was charging straight towards the outpost. Moments before it collided with the gates, the driver furiously spun the wheel, causing the car to come to a loud, screeching halt in a horizontal, parked position. The wheels dug 2 deep gouges into the soft earth before the vehicle was finally stabilized, even though it shuddered and clanked as though it was about to burst with fire. A few pieces of unknown machinery actually broke off and fell to the ground. Ahaha! The fat man let out a jubilant laugh, not worried about the vehicle at all as he snuffed out his cigarette on the dashboard. We're back. After suffering through this unspeakably rocky ride, Cloudhawk couldn't help but start to puke up a storm. Alas, there was no food in his stomach at all, and so all he was able to puke up was bile. As for the surrounding mercenaries, they all started to laugh and mock their latest rookie. Ha ha ha. This kid is such a pussy. He's useless. If you want to go back and be a scav, there's still time. Cloudhawk felt as though his intestines were falling apart. Who the hell could endure a car ride like that? These mercenaries drove like suicidal madmen. This was Cloudhawk's second time riding a car. For him to be able to endure it for as long as he had was already quite impressive. Cloudhawk lifted his head up and was about to start arguing with the mercenaries, but his words died on his lips as he stared numbly towards the front. This was a place which could actually be called a town. It was ringed with a layer of bristling steel wire fences, with many ruined tires, boulders, and sandbags stacked together to form a defensive wall, with a series of wooden watchtowers overlooking from behind. The watchtowers were roughly 7 or 8 meters tall, and each watchtower had numerous archer guards within them. Tartarus mercs. Open up. The gate was really just a heavily modified jumbo truck that was parked horizontally in front of an opening. Once the guards verified their identities, the truck drove off to one side, allowing them to enter. The outpost was filled with many ragged, makeshift houses that were clustered in a haphazard fashion, the vast majority of which had people within them. At the very center, there was a tall building that seemed exceptionally eye-catching. So this was an excavator base. Cloudhawk's heart was filled with incredible eagerness and excitement. All his life, for as far back as he could remember, he had been a scavenger who had been trying to survive the ruins as best he could. Every day, he ate bugs and grass to stay alive while drinking highly contaminated rainwater. Becoming an excavator, this was Cloudhawk's dream. The outpost was now before his very eyes. Was he about to discard his former life of dining on the wind and sleeping out in the open? Some of the guards walked over to greet them. Y'all have been gone for several days. Must have made a killing this time. The outpost guards were dressed in bronze-colored leather armor, and they wore both wind goggles and breathing masks that covered half of their faces. Their gazes were focused on Cloudhawk, and one of them said in a rather malicious way, "Hey, a fresh face. That's against regs." Regs. In this era, there were no such things as regulations. These people were nothing more than watchdogs. Mad Dog and Sly Fox didn't hold them in any regard, but there was no point in offending them on purpose. In addition, they really had made a killing on this mission. Sly Fox magnanimously offered the guards half a pack of cigarettes. A killing. We risk our necks every day. You guys have it much better. This kid is a new recruit. Take it easy on us, alright? Sly Fox, no need to be so polite. How could we make things hard for you? Hurry on in. Mad Dog gave the rather dazed Cloud Hawk a hard push, and he immediately scurried inside alongside the mercenaries. In an era of chaos, building up a homeland was no easy task. Everyone had to start from scratch, and everything you needed you'd have to manufacture for yourself. Black Flag Outpost was fully equipped and outfitting, making it quite a rare sight in the wastelands. It had inns, bars, warehouses, parking lots. It essentially had everything. As a central excavator hub, it also had all sorts of things for sale. Metal instruments, strange parts, leather and cloth, all types of shops and stalls could be found here. If you were lucky enough and skilled enough, you'd be able to cobble together a suit of armor from those various parts and components, or perhaps a pistol. In fact, you might even be able to assemble your own vehicle. This was an excavator base. A completely different world. Black Flag Outpost ain't a charity operation. Every single person who lives here has to pay a price for it. Wanna enjoy the resources this place has to offer? Then use your life to fight for it. The fat man summarized it thusly. This place is heaven for the strong, but hell for the weak. After speaking, he reached down subconsciously to grab a cigarette, only to remember that he had already given away that half-pack. He let out a few curses towards the gate guards, then continued to speak to Cloud Hawk. Remember. If you ain't strong enough, then this place won't be much better than the wastelands. In fact, it could be worse. Right at this moment, Cloud Hawk noticed a number of skeletally thin women dressed in tattered rags who were standing by the roadside. Ignoring the piercing cold, they put on all sorts of alluring poses as they tried to seduce the men passing by, their faces filled with looks of entreaty. What are they doing? In this day and age, men trade their lives while women trade their flesh. That's how the world works. Cloud Hawk was slightly stunned. You'll see people like them everywhere. Give them a piece of bread and you can play with their bodies however you like. The tents, the back rooms, the alleyways, the intersections, they really are everywhere. Sly Fox was an experienced old hand in this regard, and he put his knowledge on full display, not really caring about whether Cloud Hawk understood or not. Problem is, the streetwalkers are no good. Most of them have some mutations, and if you screw 'em enough you'll catch something from 'em. The better ones are generally in the bars or are part of someone's private collection. Those'll be a bit more expensive. Sly Fox continued to impart his wisdom, but Cloud Hawk didn't listen to a single thing the fat man said. His attention was completely focused upon a woman who was sitting on the ground. She was so gaunt that she seemed to have no flesh on her bones at all, she really was nothing more than skin and bones. A festering sarcoma covered half of her face, and most of her hair had fallen out, revealing a large number of pus-filled pimples. In her arms, she held an infant wrapped in tattered rags. The foul stench of rot and decay emanated from the rags. Clearly, the infant had died many days ago. The look in the woman's eyes stirred something in Cloud Hawk's heart. He had seen this look on far too many occasions, a look of despair, pain, and complete numbness, almost as if she had fallen into a hell of endless darkness, never to see a sliver of light again. Her ruined body was still struggling at death's door, but she herself was mentally dead. The fuck you looking at? Sly Fox irritably slapped Cloud Hawk upside the head. I'm warning you. From the looks of her, she's probably filled with all kinds of mutations. If you screw her, your dick will probably rot off inside. Cloud Hawk was dragged away by the mercenaries. As for the woman, she just sat there with her rotting baby in her arms, not moving at all. It was as though she herself was nothing more than a corpse waiting to rot away. As for the passing travelers, few of them spared her a glance. Most of them had long since grown accustomed to such sights. Cloud Hawk began to grow confused. Weren't all excavators supposed to be able to dress in warm clothes, eat warm bread, and drink clean water? Why was this completely different from what he had imagined? It was like a pail of icy water had been thrown over his excitement and anticipation. It was like a child eagerly unwrapping a present, only to find a pile of shit inside. The outpost had quite a few crude shop stalls. However, there was no money here. The system was purely operated on the basis of bartering, with food, bullets, and fuel being the most commonly used instruments of trade. Next to them was a small inn, not quite 30 square meters in size, which was filled with murky smoke. A young, lithe, and completely nude woman was standing atop a stage, writhing about undulatingly under the dim lighting. Her rear was so perky, quite a few of the men nearby wanted to step up and give it a hard squeeze. Slaves. Slaves for sale. Up ahead was a fierce-faced slave trader standing atop a dais, spittle flying from his mouth as he extolled his products, 3 women and 2 men. They are absolutely clean, guaranteed. No sicknesses, no mutations. You can bring the women and keep them in your private collection. They have firm tits and perky asses. I guarantee they are worth the money. The men are strong and muscular. They'll be good workers. If you spend a bit of time and effort on them, they'll be strong gladiators as well. They might even win you some money in the gladiator pits. Don't miss out. The 3 women and 2 men allowed others to touch and squeeze them as they pleased. They didn't have looks of despair or pain on their faces. Instead, they smiled in a pandering fashion, hoping that they would find a good master who would treat them well. A wind blew through a nearby alleyway, bringing with it the stench of rotting corpses. Every day, 1 or 2 people would die within these side alleys and hidden corners. There was nothing strange about this. Smokes, wine, women, lust, violence, corruption, these were the main themes of this place, and the smell of decadence and moral decay filled every inch of it. Men traded their lives. Women traded their flesh. Heaven for the strong. Hell for the weak. Cloud Hawk was beginning to understand what Sly Fox had said to him. In the center of the outpost there was an erect stone stele, as well as a few rules that seemed to have been written with blood. The stone stele only described what the rules were, not what the punishments were, but the burnt and blackened stakes next to them quietly explained it all. Every single stake had badly burnt corpses that were tied to them using steel chains. In the outpost, there was just one type of punishment, execution by fire. See that? Sly Fox pointed as he spoke. That place up ahead is the private residence of the outpost commander. I'm warning you right now, stay the hell away from that place. They'll crush you as easily as a cockroach, and would care less. The towering building Sly Fox was pointing to could be seen from the outpost gates, as prominent as a crane within a flock of chickens. Electric lights could be seen illuminating the rooms within the building. Electricity, this was an extremely precious and rare commodity. There were very few scavengers in the wastelands who were lucky enough to excavate a power generator of the old times or who had the skills to create one. Only a very, very elite few were able to make use of this precious resource. So this was the commander's residence. Cloud Hawk couldn't help but fantasize about what was inside. What sort of 3-headed, 6-armed freak could possibly be so powerful as to control and command an outpost like this? Be so mighty as to ensure that even fierce fellows like Sly Fox and Mad Dog would have no choice but to comply, not daring to revolt. You came at just the right time. Sly Fox stared at the words on the stone stele, then sighed. A year ago, Black Flag Outpost was 10 times as chaotic as it is now. You'd see rape and murder out in the open, and both the slave traders and meat merchants hunted and grabbed people with impunity. Ever since the new commander arrived, things have taken a turn for the better. She personally wrote all the words on this stone stele. New commander. What happened to the old one? What do you think? Sly Fox looked at Cloud Hawk as if he were an idiot. Killed, of course. There's no such thing as a permanent commander. Every so often, an old commander will be killed, and the killer will become the new commander. Eventually, he'll be killed and replaced as well. People always follow the strong. If you think you are tough enough, you can go and challenge the commander as well. Sly Fox and Mad Dog were tough, but they were still nothing more than mercenaries. They relied on the outpost to provide them with the information and missions they needed to earn their commissions and feed themselves. They would never dare to disobey the commander or to try to take that position for themselves. As for Cloud Hawk, he wouldn't even dare to imagine such a thing. A raucous commotion could be heard coming from up ahead. More than 10 men who were dressed like outpost guards and who wore breathing masks were working together to drag an enormous corpse forwards. Amazingly enough, they were actually dragging a long, strange beast that was roughly half a meter thick. Its sticky skin was emanating a mucus-like fluid that instantly drenched the ground beneath it, causing a series of corrosive sizzling sounds that caused Cloudhawk's blood to run cold. Although the beast was only half a meter thick, it was roughly 10 meters long. Not too far away from the soldiers was an area where the ground seemed to have been churned. There was also an opening in the ground which was roughly half a meter in diameter. The surrounding area was covered with that mucus-like fluid, and there were a number of corpses on the ground as well. Those corpses had all been heavily corroded to the point where they looked as though they were made of melting wax. Oh, fuck, another giant earthworm. For fuck's sake, that's the second one this month. Cloudhawk had never seen such a terrifying creature before. What is that? Sly Fox shook his head. When you have this many people gathered together in an outpost, if I was a mutabeast, I'd choose this place as my hunting grounds as well. Still, for a few to appear every so often is nothing. The real thing you have to worry about is mutabeasts' waves. That's what ends up wrecking most outposts. Ha! Relax. Nothing to be scared of. One of the veteran mercenaries patted Cloudhawk on the shoulders. You'll get used to it, if you live long enough. When the outpost soldiers dragged the terrifying corpse through the streets, the nearby passers-by all parted ways without even glancing at them. Were they really able to get used to such things? Cloudhawk suddenly felt as though he was walking on thorns. Every single step he took made him feel extremely uncomfortable. Book 1, Chapter 9 The Mercenary Base. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The base of the Tartarus mercenaries was a stand-alone compound protected by stone walls and iron barbed wire. The grounds were littered with boulders, pillars, sandbags, wooden rakes, and other training equipment. Many different pieces of metallic parts and other miscellaneous items were also spread throughout the area. The compound had several large, ragged-looking buildings that were all connected to each other. There was a dormitory, a repair shop, and even a storage vault. Although they all looked quite ugly, nobody in the wastelands gave a damn about appearances. Just having these things was already incredibly impressive. Judging from their base, these mercenaries truly did have some standing here. That meant this should be a fairly safe place, right? Just as this thought entered Cloudhawk's mind, a savage and ferocious black figure suddenly roared and charged straight towards him. It moved with incredible speed. It was so fast that Cloudhawk wasn't even able to see the creature clearly. All Cloudhawk could tell was that it looked like an enormous beast. The creature knocked Cloudhawk to the ground, towering over him. The creature emanated a horrifying, nauseating stench, and it began to bite downwards towards Cloudhawk's neck with its long, savage teeth. Woola! Mad Dog immediately let out an explosive shout. Stop that! The crazy beast halted its assault, baring its teeth and growling before it took a few steps back. Its dark red eyes, however, continued to stare at Cloudhawk unblinkingly. The creature remained in a crouched attacking position, as though it was unwilling to just let go of this delectable prey. Fuck me. Which Sonyafabich let Woola out? Get the rope. Mad Dog let out a loud shout, while Cloudhawk managed to calm down slightly as he clambered to his feet. This was a strange creature which looked like a big ape. It had to weigh at least 60 or 70 kilograms, and its head was 3 times larger than that of a normal human being's. It had a big nose and a big mouth that stretched all the way back to its ears, seeming to split its head in half when it snarled. Its mouth was filled with sharp, shark-like teeth. There had to be at least 3 or 4 rows of teeth. It could probably bite through metal armor without any problems at all. Flesh and bone was even less of an issue. The creature had a total of 6 thick and powerful arms. As for its speed, Cloudhawk had just borne witness to it personally. It most likely moved faster than the majority of creatures in the wastelands. Why would the mercenaries have such a strange beast in their headquarters? Don't worry. We've been raising Woola here in the compound. It has a very sharp nose, and whenever someone it doesn't recognize tries to barge in, it'll deal with the trespasser the same way it just dealt with you. It's been fed on man-meat ever since it was young. It'd gnaw all the flesh off your bones in just a few minutes. Mad Dog personally held the creature back and started to tie him up again. The creature shook its large head repeatedly in an unhappy manner, but even it was unable to resist Mad Dog's strange, frightening strength. Be a good boy, Woola. Later, I'll go to the black market and get you your favorite snack, a human leg. The creature had eyes, a mouth, a nose, and even fingers. Although it was incredibly twisted-looking and ugly, Cloudhawk had the strange feeling that this creature was actually some sort of highly mutated human being. A strange look on his face, Cloudhawk asked, "What the hell is it?" You've probably guessed already. This here is a mutant. Its parents might have been normal humans like us, but it underwent heavy mutations in its mother's womb. From what I heard, it chewed its way through its mother's guts and belly, then clawed its way out, Mad Dog began to explain. It was captured shortly after it was born, and we've raised it and trained it like a dog ever since. Critter's actually a perfect watchdog for our base. Cloudhawk could hardly believe it. He didn't want to believe it. You could actually train a mutant the way you would a dog. But it was true that this Woola creature really could no longer be considered a human being either. Still, because it was once a human being, Woola was still more clever than ordinary animals. At the very least, it could understand the human language and human speech. And yet, it was even more savage and bloodthirsty than most animals. In short, it was an absolutely terrifying freak of nature. This entire time, Woola's gaze never left Cloudhawk's face. Drops of saliva continuously dripped out of its mouth, causing Cloudhawk to shiver with fear. He could sense the animosity and hostility radiating from the freak's eyes. Hey, boss. Men Mad Dog and Slyfox. Y'all came back already. The entire mercenary group had roughly 20 or 30 people, and most of them had arrived by now. The mercenary group was divided into a total of 3 squads, and 2 of the squad captains were Slyfox and Mad Dog. The third captain was a tall and skinny Asian. He had a pallid complexion, dark baggy eyes, and wore a pair of spectacles. On the surface, he looked quite calm and weak, and he was dressed in very proper-looking clothes that didn't seem all that remarkable. And yet, in this day and age, to seem completely ordinary and normal was, in and of itself, extremely abnormal. In fact, it could be said that he had a scholarly aura which was completely different from that of this era. Hey, Mantis. Slyfox chortled as he walked over to the man. Man, I'm happy to make it back in one piece and see you again. Mantis adjusted his glasses, a frigid metallic light gleaming from them. His eyes weren't that large, but they were as cold as steel and seemed to contain no human emotions whatsoever. When Mantis turned to stare at Cloudhawk, the latter instantly felt a chill enter his heart and spread out through his limbs. He felt as though he could barely move or breathe. The gaze was like a sharp scalpel that had been placed against his throat. The slightest motion would result in his throat being cut. In this place, everyone who had a nickname was a figure of no small ability. Mantis might not necessarily be as powerful as Slyfox or Mad Dog, but Cloud Hawk had the feeling that he was even more dangerous. It was like the difference between a cobra and a lion. The cobra might not be as strong as the lion, but a cobra hidden in the darkness could be even more dangerous than the lion. We picked up a scav on our way back. Sly Fox beamed at Mantis, his chubby face an amusing, complete contrast to Mantis' emotionless expression. Sly Fox then added, "He's a recovery-oriented meta. Not really worth a damn, but we're lacking in the logistics department, so I let him in." A recovery meta. Those were almost useless. The mercenaries turned their scornful gazes upon Cloud Hawk, making him feel extremely uncomfortable and also irritated. What gave them the right to look down on him like that? Were recovery metas really as useless as they were claiming? Ever since he was born, Cloud Hawk had always been a stubborn person who never liked to admit inferiority to others. He simply couldn't stand being looked down upon by these people. Enough, kid. You should be leaping for joy at having been recruited into Tartarus. We have a sterling reputation in this outpost, but let me make it clear to you right now, you aren't here to just loaf around and enjoy life. Starting today, you'll only be given 2 pieces of bread and 1 bottle of water each day. In exchange, you do whatever the hell we tell you to do. No whining and no foot dragging. Can't handle it? Then fuck off. Tartarus ain't charity. Got it? Cloud Hawk relaxed his clenched fists. Got it. Sly Fox had an excited look on his face as he said, "We made out like bandits on this mission. We need to hold a celebration. Ha! Long live the boss." These men were like beasts, they lived off of their weapons and the blood of others. No one ever knew what the morrow might bring, and so they had long since grown accustomed to enjoying today. Cloud Hawk had no idea as to how mercenaries celebrated, but he was both hungry and thirsty. All he hoped for was some food to eat. The skies slowly began to darken. By now, the mercenaries had produced a large amount of food and cheap wine. The quality of life in the outpost really was thousands of times better than life in the ruins, at least in terms of food. The mercenaries had access to both meat and vegetables. The meat came from all kinds of mutabeasts, was served on platters, and had actually been cooked properly. Cloud Hawk was able to smell their enticing aroma from far away. By now, Woola had been tied up. One of the mercenaries came over with a giant bowl filled with chopped up bits of raw, bloody meat. Woola immediately dug into the meat, devouring it with abandon. The mutant even chewed up and crunched the bones, swallowing everything. As for what type of creature the meat came from and what body parts were involved, Cloud Hawk simply couldn't even begin to imagine the answer. Unfortunately, Woola continued to stare intently at Cloud Hawk even as it continued to devour its food. Cloud Hawk was terrified of moving closer to Woola, for fear of being pounced on and killed on the spot. Damn that beast! Woola sniffed the air a few times with its large black nose, then suddenly stopped eating as it raised its head and began to roar gutter ally. Right at this moment, nearly 20 or so scantily clad women came in from outside. Although all of them had coarse skin and sickly faces, they were indeed far better than the streetwalkers Cloud Hawk had seen earlier. Boys! Mad Dog lifted his glass up high. Have fun tonight. The mercenaries let out lusty cries that almost sounded like the howling of wolves, then began to drag the women over in a rather brutish manner. To these women, being able to eat and drink was like manna falling from the heavens. As for Woola, the creature seemed to be very uncomfortable with so many strangers being present, and so it continued to roar and bark non-stop. This did not, however, put a damper in the moods of the mercenaries, and they quickly began to act with fearless licentiousness. Seeing that Woola was no longer staring at him, Cloud Hawk immediately circled around the creature and went to grab some food for himself. Hey newbie! None of this is for you. Fug off, yeah. The Tartarus mercenaries didn't operate a charity, everyone was rewarded or punished in accordance with their deeds. Cloud Hawk was not only a newbie, he was a newbie no one gave a shit about. This naturally meant he had no right to enjoy the food alongside them. 2 pieces of bread and 1 bottle of water. That's all you get. Sly Fox gestured towards someone. Hey, you. What's your face? Yeah, get over here. Find a place for the new bee to stay. The base is full. He wasn't even going to be allowed to live with the other mercenaries. Cloudhawk was issued a short sword and a few candles, then led to a tattered room nearby and told to stay there. This small room was filled with dust and mold. Those tiny candles flickered and sputtered in the dark night wind, a clear reflection of the kid's own mood. He sat there in the ugly room, rather confused and rather uncomfortable. It was now rather frighteningly quiet outside. This room was roughly 200 meters away from the mercenary base. If anything was to happen, would the mercenaries be able to make it in time? Would they even care to? Who knew? The only thing Cloudhawk knew for certain was that these mercenaries viewed him as an expendable newbie. Cloudhawk finished the remainder of his rock-hard bread, then drank all of his water. He checked to make sure the beam across his door was set, then picked up the short sword the mercenaries had given him and placed it by the side of his bed. He then gently blew out the candles, plunging the entire room into darkness. Cloudhawk lay down upon his straw bed. The straw poked at his skin and was rather uncomfortable, but at least it was fairly warm. Was this how life would be for him in the future? Cloudhawk felt both nervous and lost. He had no plans, no goals anymore. He had no idea what he was going to do tomorrow, nor did he know what the future would be like. Cloudhawk shook his head furiously as he mentally consoled himself, what else do you want? You not only have bread and water every day, you even have a place to stay. What do you have to complain about? Although things here weren't exactly as he had envisioned them to be, it was still much better than life as a scavenger, right? No point in overthinking things. Staying alive and living a good life was what mattered.